stand on the Galata Bridge at first light. The fishermen are already here. Lines in the water below. Thermoses of tea wedged between the railing posts. The ferries are crossing the Golden Horn, their wakes spreading white against the dark water. On the hill to your south, a dome rises against the sky, a dome that has been standing in roughly that same position for nearly 1,500 years, built by an emperor who wanted to prove that his civilization could do something no civilization had done before. To your east, the Bosphorus runs cold and fast between two continents. Every ship passing through that water, every tanker and ferry and fishing boat, is doing what ships have been doing at this exact point for 2,600 years, moving between worlds. Europe on one side, Asia on the other, and this city sitting on the hinge between them, watching everything go by, taxing what it can, absorbing what it cannot stop. Few cities have served as capital of two world empires. Few places on earth have been fought over, written about, prayed in, and argued about for as long and as consistently as this peninsula above this strait. It has been called Byzantium. It has been called Constantinople. It has been called Istanbul. It answered to each name with equal conviction, as if the name never quite mattered as much as the ground beneath it. This is the story of that ground, of the people who found it, fought over it, built on it, burned it, and rebuilt it again, of why a bend in a strait between two seas produced one of the most consequential cities in the history of human civilization. We are going back to where it started, to a harbor, an oracle, and a decision that changed everything. Chapter 1. The Greeks and the Perfect Harbor. Imagine you are a sailor from the Greek city of Megara, sometime around 660 years before the birth of Christ. You have spent your life on the Aegean Sea. You know its moods and its sudden violence. You have sailed north through the Hellespont, the narrow passage connecting the Aegean to the waters beyond, and navigated the Sea of Marmara, that inland body of water sitting between the Aegean and the Black Sea like a room between two hallways. You are looking for a place to found a colony, because Megara is a trading city, and trading cities need outposts where ships can stop, goods can accumulate, and wealth can grow. You have heard about the land at the far end of the Marmara, where the water narrows again before opening into the Black Sea. You have heard the fishing is extraordinary, the currents predictable, the terrain defensible. So you sail northeast, round a final headland, and you see it. What you see stops you. On your left, a triangular peninsula of high ground juts into the water where the strait meets the sea. It is naturally defended on three sides by water, steep enough at its edges to make assault difficult, flat enough at its crown to support a city. Directly ahead, a long, narrow inlet branches off from the main strait and runs roughly 5 miles to the southwest. The water in that inlet is so calm, so completely sheltered from the currents of the main channel, that a fleet of ships could anchor there in almost any weather. It is so perfectly shaped that it looks less like a feature of geography and more like something deliberately engineered. That inlet is the Golden Horn, and the moment you understand what you are looking at, you understand why this particular piece of ground was always going to matter. The Greeks who came here in the 7th century before the Common Era were not the first people to notice its value. Archaeological evidence from excavations throughout the Istanbul Peninsula, including the major discoveries at the Yeni Kapı site in the 2000s, shows human occupation going back 6,000 years or more. Chalcolithic and Bronze Age settlements have been identified at multiple sites across the city. The ground that people now walk through to reach the Grand Bazaar has been occupied by human beings for a span of time that is genuinely difficult to hold in the mind. But the Greek colonization of the late 7th century was the moment that shaped everything that followed, and it came with a story attached. The Greek geographer Strabo, writing in the 1st century before the Common Era, records a tradition about the founding of the settlement. According to this tradition, colonists from Megara had already established a city on the Asian shore of the Bosphorus, at a place called Chalcedon, roughly 17 years before they settled the peninsula across the water. When the Megarian leader Byzas consulted the oracle at Delphi about where to establish his colony, the oracle reportedly told him to settle opposite the land of the blind. The answer seemed cryptic. Eventually, Byzas concluded that the people of Chalcedon must be the blind ones. They had chosen the adequate Asian shore while leaving the extraordinary peninsula directly across the water unoccupied. Anyone who could look at the Golden Horn and its commanding heights and choose the opposite bank had, by any navigational logic available, failed to see what was in front of them. Byzas settled the peninsula. The city took his name, Byzantium. How much of this story is documented history, and how much is the mythology that cities construct around their origins? Scholars genuinely debate. The oracle tradition belongs to a genre of founding narratives that Greek cities produced with enthusiasm and varying reliability. What we can say with confidence, based on the archaeological and written record, is that a Greek colony was established on this peninsula around 660 years before the Common Era, that it grew quickly, and that the advantages its founders identified proved to be exactly as significant as they appeared. The Golden Horn was the key to everything. In the ancient world, before steam power made it possible to move ships against wind and current, a harbour was not simply a convenience. It was the difference between a city and a village. Ships needed protection from storms, from swells, from the sudden weather changes that the Bosphorus could produce without warning. A fleet caught in open water in a bad storm did not simply suffer delays. It sank. Cargoes were lost. Voyages ended permanently. The Golden Horn solved all of these problems at once. It was deep enough for large vessels. It was calm enough, sheltered by hills on both sides, that ships could ride out almost any weather in safety. It was long enough to accommodate hundreds of vessels at once, and it was positioned so perfectly relative to the main strait that ships entering or leaving could do so without fighting the Bosphorus currents, which run south to north on the surface and north to south underneath, creating conditions that defeated less favorably positioned harbors entirely. The fishing made the commercial case even stronger. The Bosphorus is one of the richest fishing straits in the world. The currents carry enormous quantities of fish between the Black Sea and the Marmara, and those fish congregate at the mouth of the Golden Horn in numbers that ancient sources describe with genuine wonder. For a Greek colony in the 7th century, Control of that abundance meant control of one of the most valuable resources in the ancient Eastern Mediterranean. Dried and salted fish from these waters traveled across the Greek world. The city grew wealthy from fish before it grew powerful from geography. But the geography was the thing that would define Byzantine history across every century that followed. The Bosphorus Strait is approximately 19 miles long and between half a mile and 2 miles wide at its various points. Every ship moving between the Mediterranean world and the Black Sea had to pass through it. There was no alternative route. The Black Sea coast beyond the strait contained the grain-producing lands of what is now Ukraine and southern Russia, regions that fed the cities of the Aegean when local harvests failed. It contained timber, which the treeless Aegean coastlines desperately needed. It contained metals, hides, and the goods that connected the Mediterranean world to the far reaches of Asia. Every ship carrying any of those resources in either direction passed through the water visible from the walls of Byzantium. The city that controlled the Bosphorus did not need to produce much of its own wealth. It could tax the wealth moving through it. It could charge for pilotage through the tricky currents. It could sell provisions and repairs to ships that had no choice but to stop. The position was, in modern terms, a natural monopoly of geography rather than of production or technology, and therefore a monopoly that no competitor could replicate by building something better somewhere else. The Megarian colonists understood this intuitively, because they were traders who thought in terms of routes and access and the movement of goods. What they could not have understood was the full political and military dimension of what they had chosen. That would take centuries to become clear, and it would become clear through a series of encounters with powers far larger than Megara, each of which arrived at the Bosphorus and recognized, in its own way, that whoever held this ground held something that could not be found anywhere else. Those encounters and the extraordinary story of what this city became because of them begin in the next chapter. But first, understand this: the ground always won. Every power that came here eventually discovered that you could not simply pass through Byzantium, inure it, or destroy it and move on. The geography would not allow it. The ground demanded a city, and the city, once built, demanded to survive. The ground always won. Chapter 2: Persians, Spartans, and the city that everyone wanted. Picture the scene from above. A narrow strip of water, no more than half a mile wide at its narrowest, runs between two continents. On the western bank, a triangular peninsula rises above the water, its harbour perfectly sheltered, its heights commanding the entire strait. Every ship moving between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea must pass directly below those heights. Every army moving between Europe and Asia must find a way across that water. Now understand why this made Byzantium one of the most coveted pieces of ground in the Eastern Mediterranean world. To control the Bosphorus was to hold the hinge between two worlds: the grain of Ukraine, the timber beyond the steppe, the metals and furs and amber that connected the Mediterranean economy to the interior of Eurasia. All of it moved through this narrow water. An empire that wanted both the Mediterranean world and the Black Sea world had to have the Bosphorus, and a city that sat directly on the Bosphorus was either a partner or an obstacle, but it could never be ignored. Every great power that rose in the eastern Mediterranean eventually learned this. Most learned it the hard way. Darius, the first of Persia, was the first to demonstrate the lesson at full scale. His empire, in 513 years before the Common Era, stretched from northwestern India to the Aegean coast, encompassing perhaps 50 million people governed through a provincial system of genuine sophistication. He had organized a road network, a postal service, and a tax system that later empires would essentially copy. He had conquered Egypt and pushed into Central Asia. When he turned his attention to the Scythian peoples of the steppe north of the Black Sea, who had been raiding his northern borders with the effectiveness of people who could simply ride away when heavier forces appeared. His path required crossing the Bosphorus. The crossing was the engineering problem. A man named Mandrocles of Samos solved it. The bridge of boats that Mandrocles constructed deserves more recognition than it typically receives. 1/2 mile of open water, currents running at several knots on the surface, wind shifting without warning, and he built a platform stable enough for an army to march across with horses, supply wagons, and siege equipment. Herodotus records that Mandrocles was so proud of the achievement he had a painting made of it, depicting Darius watching his army cross from a throne on the hill above. He dedicated the painting to the temple of Hera on his home island of Samos. The painting is gone. The bridge is gone. What survives is the fact Darius crossed into Europe. He pushed deep into the steppe. The Scythians refused to engage. They retreated into the limitless grassland, burning whatever they could not carry, leaving nothing for the Persian army to fight or to eat. The campaign ended without a decisive engagement, and Darius withdrew back across the bridge into Asia. He had failed to conquer the steppe, but he had demonstrated something that every power after him would need to reckon with. A large army could cross the Bosphorus, and the city that sat at that crossing would be involved in every subsequent attempt to do it, whether it wanted to be or not. The following century placed Byzantium at the intersection of the conflicts that defined the Greek world: the Persian Wars, the Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta, the devastating Athenian expedition to Sicily. Each of these crises reached the Bosphorus and required Byzantium to choose sides. The city chose with the pragmatism that its geography demanded: too small to dominate, too important to endure. It survived each crisis by being useful to whoever was currently winning without becoming so useful to any single power that its destruction became another power's priority. That pragmatism was not cowardice. It was geography made into policy, and it would be tested more severely than at any previous moment when Philip of Macedon arrived from the north. Philip II of Macedon was not simply a successful general. He was the man who invented the military and political system that his son Alexander would use to conquer the known world. He developed the Macedonian phalanx, the formidable infantry formation that made his army the most effective in the Greek world. He understood the relationship between military power and diplomatic pressure in ways that his contemporaries consistently underestimated. He looked at Byzantium and saw exactly what it was: a city that controlled the single most strategically important strait in the eastern Mediterranean world, a city that could deny him access to the grain routes that fed his campaigns, a city that, if he controlled it, would give him leverage over every other power in the region. He laid siege to it in 340 years before the Common Era. with the best military technology of the age. And he failed. The failure was not for lack of trying or lack of skill. It was the harbour. The Golden Horn gave the defenders something that no land-based siege could take away. Athens, recognizing that a Macedonian Bosphorus meant Macedonian control of Athenian grain supplies, sent ships. Persia provided support for its own reasons. The sea remained open. Supplies kept coming. The city that was surrounded on land had no need to surrender as long as the water was free. Philip withdrew after roughly 2 years. He moved on to other campaigns and was eventually assassinated in 336 years before the Common Era, leaving his son Alexander to inherit his ambitions and exceed them beyond anything Philip had imagined. Alexander passed near Byzantium on his march east and did not stop. He had correctly calculated that Persia was the objective and that Byzantium was not necessary to reach it. The city survived his passage as it had survived everything else, by being positioned on ground that conquerors needed to pass through but did not need to possess. When Alexander died in 323 years before the Common Era and his empire fractured among his generals, the wars of succession transformed the eastern Mediterranean for half a century. Byzantium navigated these conflicts with practiced skill, maintaining its commercial position through every political realignment, preserving the one thing that made it valuable: the functioning harbour at the entrance to the Black Sea. By the time Rome had consolidated its position as the dominant power in the Mediterranean world, Byzantium was a prosperous city with a long history of surviving great power competition by making itself indispensable to whoever was currently winning. Rome recognized the value immediately. But Rome also brought something new to its relationship with Byzantium, something that would prove more consequential than any military campaign. Rome did not simply want to use the city. Rome wanted to make it Roman. Incorporation into the Roman provincial system brought stability and investment. New institutions appeared. The hippodrome was expanded. Aqueducts transformed the city's relationship with fresh water. The urban population grew. For roughly 3 centuries, Byzantium was a comfortable, commercially successful city within the Roman world, doing what it had always done, collecting tolls and salting fish and watching the ships go by. Then came the civil war of 193 of the Common Era, and the man who would punish Byzantium for backing the wrong claimant, Septimius Severus, besieged the city from 193 to 196. The siege lasted 3 years, a testament to the city's natural advantages even against a determined Roman army with unlimited resources. When it finally fell, Severus executed the city's leaders, demolished the walls, and stripped its legal privileges. It was the closest thing to destruction Byzantium had yet experienced. And yet, within years, Severus began rebuilding. New walls went up, larger than the ones he had demolished. New public buildings were constructed. The hippodrome was expanded. The legal privileges were gradually restored, because the thing that had made Byzantium valuable in the first place could not be punished. The Bosphorus was still there. The Golden Horn was still there. The hills were still there. Whatever you did to the city, the ground demanded that a city exist on it. And the ground always won. By the early 4th century of the Common Era, Byzantium was a rebuilt, prosperous, moderately important city in an empire showing dangerous signs of structural failure. Into this situation walked a man with a vision that no previous ruler had brought to this particular peninsula. He looked at the harbour and the strait and the hills, and he saw not a trading post or a military objective, but the future centre of civilization. His name was Constantine, and what he built here would change the world. Chapter 3. Constantine's Bet, Building the New Rome. On the 11th of May, 330 of the Common Era, Constantine I dedicated a new city on the peninsula above the Golden Horn and named it after himself, Constantinople, the city of Constantine. To understand why he made this choice, you first have to understand what he was choosing against. The Roman Empire of 324 of the Common Era was not the confident. Expanding power of the 1st and 2nd centuries, it was a system that had spent nearly a century on the edge of disintegration. Between 235 and 284 of the Common Era, the empire cycled through more than 20 emperors, most dying violently after reigns measured in months rather than years. Military threats pressed on every frontier simultaneously. Plague killed enormous portions of the population. Trade networks contracted as security collapsed. The currency had been debased to near worthlessness. The empire had not fallen, but it had come close enough that thoughtful people in the late 3rd century had genuine reason to wonder whether it would survive. Constantine had spent 2 decades fighting his way to sole control of this damaged empire through civil wars that required both military excellence and political ruthlessness in equal measure. By 324, he was the last man standing. What he had won was a system in desperate need of reform, and he approached that need with the sustained ambition of a man who understood that incremental repair was insufficient. His most fundamental decision was his relationship with Christianity. In 312 of the Common Era, the year before he defeated his final rival at the Battle of Milvian Bridge near Rome, Constantine reportedly experienced a vision connected to the Christian faith. The sources that record this differ in their details, as accounts of such experiences typically do, and historians have debated for 17 centuries how to read it. What is clear, by his own account and by the accounts of those around him, is that Constantine emerged from the civil wars as a committed patron of Christianity, and that this commitment was expressed in concrete policy. The Edict of Milan in 313, issued jointly with his co-emperor Licinius, ended the systematic persecution of Christians throughout the empire and granted broad religious tolerance. It did not immediately make Christianity the official state religion that came later under Theodosius I at the end of the 4th century. But it set the empire on a path toward becoming the sponsor and defender of a single faith. In choosing a new capital, Constantine was choosing a center for this new Christian empire, and Rome had serious liabilities for that purpose. Rome was ancient and established, which meant it was filled with the physical and social infrastructure of the old religion, with aristocratic families whose status and identity were tied to traditional Roman religious practice. With the accumulated weight of centuries of pagan tradition, reforming Rome would mean constant friction with precisely the groups whose cooperation Constantine needed. More practically, Rome was in the wrong location. The threats to the Roman Empire in the 4th century came from the north and east. Germanic peoples pressed across the Rhine and Danube frontiers. The revived Persian Empire under the Sassanid dynasty posed a serious challenge to the eastern provinces. A capital in central Italy required the emperor to travel enormous distances to respond to crises. And the 3rd century had demonstrated repeatedly how much damage an empire suffered when its ruler was perpetually on the road. A capital at the Bosphorus would sit at the exact convergence of the empire's European and Asian halves. It would be within reach of the Danube frontier. It would be accessible by sea to the eastern provinces. It would sit on the most important trade route in the eastern Mediterranean. And it would be, by the accident of geography, extraordinarily defensible. The peninsula of Byzantium was protected by water on 3 sides. The Golden Horn to the north, the Sea of Marmara to the south, the Bosphorus to the east. Only the western land approach required walls. And that approach could be fortified to a degree that made the city effectively impregnable to any force that could not also control the surrounding seas. An enemy wanting to take Constantinople by land had to breach a single fortified line across a relatively narrow front. An enemy wanting to take it by sea had to control both the Golden Horn and the Marmara simultaneously while dealing with whatever naval forces the city could deploy. Very few sites in the ancient or medieval world combined commercial centrality and natural defensibility to the degree that Constantinople did. Constantine understood this. He had studied the military geography of the eastern Mediterranean throughout his years of civil war. He knew what he was building on. Construction began in 324, and the dedication came 6 years later. A pace of building that required the resources of an empire directed with singular focus. Constantine did not simply build administrative buildings and defensive walls. He built a city designed to be, from its first day, the visible center of a new civilization. The Hippodrome was expanded to seat perhaps 100,000 spectators. Constantine filled it with monuments brought from across the ancient world, including the Serpent Column, a bronze dedication originally placed at Delphi to commemorate the Greek defeat of Persia at the Battle of Plataea in 479 years before the Common Era. That column still stands today in the square that was once the Hippodrome in Istanbul. When you walk past it, you are passing an object that has been in roughly that position for roughly 1,700 years. And that was already 800 years old when Constantine placed it there. The Forum of Constantine was laid out as the ceremonial heart of the new city, anchored by a tall column of red porphyry topped by a statue of the emperor. That column still stands on a busy Istanbul street, damaged by fire and earthquake across 17 centuries. Surrounded by traffic that moves around it without pausing. Churches rose across the peninsula, funded by imperial resources. The first version of what would eventually become the Hagia Sophia was constructed during Constantine's reign. A wooden-roofed basilica bearing no physical resemblance to the domed masterpiece that would follow 2 centuries later. Population came quickly. Constantinople offered imperial patronage, commercial opportunity, and the particular energy of a new capital where positions and influence were available to those who arrived early. Senators were encouraged, sometimes pressured, to relocate from Rome. Merchants recognized that the emperor's city was where contracts would be awarded. Craftsmen and laborers followed the money. Within a generation, Constantinople had hundreds of thousands of inhabitants. Within a century, it was one of the largest cities in the world. But alongside the physical construction, something else was forming in the streets and churches and markets and schools of the new capital. A new civilization was assembling itself. A civilization that was simultaneously Roman in its administration, Christian in its faith, and Greek in its language and daily culture. The administration was conducted in Latin, organized according to Roman legal and institutional traditions. The faith was Christian, organized around bishops and councils and theological disputes that Constantine had made the central business of the empire. The language of the streets and markets and households, and eventually the church itself, was Greek. The Eastern Mediterranean was a predominantly Greek-speaking world, and the Greek tradition of philosophical inquiry was woven into educated daily life in ways that Latin simply was not in these provinces. These three identities, Roman, Christian, and Greek, sat in creative tension with each other for the entire 1,000-year span of what we call the Byzantine Empire. Though the people living in it always called themselves Romans, they would have found the word Byzantine, invented by later historians to distinguish the Eastern Empire from the Western. Completely foreign. They were Romans. They spoke Greek. They were Christian. That combination was simply what a Roman was. The western half of the empire, centered on the old capital, collapsed in 476 of the Common Era when a Germanic chieftain deposed the last Western emperor. The eastern half, centered on Constantinople, would continue for nearly 1,000 years afterward, surviving crises that would have destroyed any less structurally sound political entity. Constantine had built better than he knew. He had created not simply a city but a system, with a defensible capital at its center, a faith that provided moral legitimacy, an administrative tradition that gave institutional continuity, and a geographic position that guaranteed commercial relevance regardless of what happened to the political order around it. Consider what that system actually meant in practice. Cities rise and fall on the availability of resources, the protection of trade routes, the loyalty of populations, and the capability of their rulers. Constantinople had structural advantages in all four categories that no other city in the ancient world could match simultaneously. The geography guaranteed the trade. The faith guaranteed a form of legitimacy that transcended any individual ruler. The administrative tradition guaranteed institutional continuity even through bad reigns. And the walls guaranteed that bad reigns could be survived without the city falling to an external enemy. The system would be tested many times, but it was about to face its first great internal test. A dispute not about territory or money or military power, but about the nature of God. And at the center of that test would stand two of the most extraordinary human beings who ever occupied an imperial throne. Chapter 4. The Byzantine Centuries, Gold, God and Greek Fire. There is a building in Istanbul that has no equal anywhere on earth. Not because it is the largest, not because the materials used to construct it are the rarest or the craftsmanship the most technically demanding. Though the craftsmanship is extraordinary and the materials came from every corner of the known world, the Hagia Sophia has no equal because of what it does to the person who walks through its doors and looks up. The dome rises approximately 55 to 56 meters above the floor. It sits on a ring of 40 windows that flood the interior with light in a way that, to people who first saw it in the 6th century of the Common Era, appeared physically impossible. The walls are covered in marble of a dozen different colors. The mosaics, where they survive, are made of glass fragments backed with gold leaf that catch the light and return it transformed. The space is so large and so luminous that the historian Procopius, writing within years of its completion, described the dome as appearing to be suspended from heaven by a golden chain rather than resting on human engineering. Procopius was a sophisticated writer who did not reach for supernatural explanations casually. When he wrote that the Hagia Sophia seemed to hang from heaven, he was attempting to describe something that the building genuinely produces in almost everyone who enters it. The dome appears to float. The light seems to emanate from the structure itself. The space feels larger than its dimensions, because the eye cannot find a resting point and keeps traveling upward. This building was constructed in 5 years and 10 months. That single fact tells you something essential about the civilization that produced it. The Hagia Sophia we see today, the third church of that name to stand on the same site, was built between 532 and 537 of the Common Era under the orders of the Emperor Justinian I. It was designed by 2 men, Anthemius of Tralles and Isidore of Miletus, who were mathematicians and natural philosophers rather than architects in the modern sense. They approached the problem of the Great Dome as a problem in applied geometry, and their solution was a structural innovation that changed the history of architecture. Previous large domes sat directly on circular walls. The Hagia Sophia's dome rests on 4 curved triangular surfaces called pendentives, which transfer its enormous weight to 4 massive piers, while creating the visual impression that the dome has no visible support. The ring of windows at its base interrupts the structural mass in a way that appears to violate basic principles of how stone and brick behave under load. The building seems, from inside, to be doing something impossible. It has been doing it for nearly 1,500 years. But the Hagia Sophia did not exist in isolation. It was the centerpiece of a reign that attempted something no previous empire had quite dared. Justinian wanted to restore the Roman Empire to its full territorial extent. He wanted to recover the western provinces lost to Germanic kingdoms over the previous century. He wanted to reunify the Christian Church, which was being torn apart by theological disputes, producing actual violence in Constantinople's streets. And he wanted to organize the entire body of Roman law. 1,000 years of legislation and legal commentary into a single, coherent system. He more or less succeeded at the last of these, the Corpus Juris Civilis, compiled under Justinian's direction by a team of lawyers led by a man named Tribonian, remains the foundation of the legal systems of most of continental Europe today. When a French or German or Italian court applies a principle of civil law, it is often applying something first articulated by Roman jurists centuries before Justinian and organized into its current form by his lawyers in the 500s. The legal inheritance of the Western world runs through Constantinople. He partially succeeded at military reconquest. His general Belisarius, one of the finest commanders of the ancient world, and a man whose career deserves far more attention than it typically receives, reconquered North Africa from the Vandals in 533 to 534, and Italy from the Ostrogoths in a campaign lasting from 535 to 554. For a brief period in the mid-6th century, the Mediterranean was again largely under Roman control. The theological reunification proved impossible. Disputes about the nature of Christ had been generating violent controversy since the Council of Chalcedon in 451, and the divisions were too deep, too rooted in genuine theological conviction, reinforced by regional and cultural identity, for any emperor to resolve by decree. These divisions exist today in the form of the Oriental Orthodox churches of Egypt, Ethiopia, and Syria. Justinian tried everything. Nothing worked. Through all of this, his wife was with him, and without her, he might not have survived to try any of it. Theodora is one of the most remarkable people in the history of any civilization. And her story is extraordinary, partly because we know it in unusual detail for a woman of the ancient world. She was born sometime around 500 of the Common Era, the daughter of a bear keeper who worked in the Constantinople hippodrome. Her father died when she was young. Her mother, left with 3 daughters and no income, brought them to appeal to the racing faction that had employed their father. That faction declined to help. A rival faction agreed. Theodora grew up understanding, at the most fundamental level, that survival depended on reading power correctly and positioning yourself relative to it with absolute clarity. She became an actress and mime performer, occupations that in 6th century Byzantine society carried a legal and social stigma that made them formally incompatible with respectable life. She traveled to North Africa as a young woman, worked in Cyrene for a period, and returned to Constantinople apparently transformed by experiences she described in religious terms. She began living quietly, working wool. The sources suggest she was living in a neighborhood near the palace district when Justinian first became aware of her. Though the precise circumstances of their meeting are not recorded with certainty, Justinian fell in love with her. He wanted to marry her. The law said he could not. He persuaded his uncle to change the law. They married in 525. When Justin died and Justinian became emperor 3 years later, Theodora became empress. What she did with that position was without precedent in Byzantine history. In 532 of the Common Era, the year before construction began on the Hagia Sophia, Constantinople experienced the most violent urban uprising in its history. The Nika riots began as a dispute between the blue and green racing factions that organized much of the city's popular and political life. When those factions united against the government, the result was 5 days of destruction that burned large sections of the city, including the original Hagia Sophia, produced the proclamation of a rival emperor by the rioters in the hippodrome, and left Justinian reportedly preparing to flee the city by ship. Theodora stopped him. The account in Procopius's official history preserves what is described as her speech to the imperial council at the moment of crisis. She told the assembled officials that she would not flee. She said that royal purple made a fine burial shroud. She told them that a person who had reigned could not endure to be a fugitive. Whether these were her precise words cannot be confirmed from the sources available. What is historical fact is that Justinian did not flee. His general Belisarius led troops into the hippodrome and suppressed the uprising with decisive force. The uprising ended. The throne was saved. Justinian remained on the throne. Theodora remained beside him for 21 years until her death in 548. She used her position to advance legal protections for women, to support theological positions that differed from Justinian's own, to conduct independent diplomacy with foreign rulers, and to act as something genuinely unprecedented in Byzantine tradition, a co-ruler in substance rather than a ceremonial consort in name. After her death, Justinian ruled for 17 more years. He outlived most of the people who had made his reign extraordinary. The plague that struck Constantinople in 541, the first major outbreak of bubonic plague in European history, had killed perhaps a third of the city's population and recurred in waves. Justinian died in 565, having reigned for 38 years. He left behind a legal code that would shape European civilization for 15 centuries, and a church of incomparable beauty, along with an empire that was, despite everything, smaller and more stressed than the one he had inherited. What came after was a period of contraction and external pressure that would have destroyed most political systems. The Persian Sassanid Empire took advantage of Byzantine weakness to push deep into imperial territory. Between 602 and 628 of the Common Era, Persian armies conquered Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. Jerusalem fell in 614. The true cross, the most sacred relic in Christendom, was carried off to Persia. Emperor Heraclius, who came to power in 610, spent the first decade of his reign fighting for the empire's survival, and the second decade achieving one of the most remarkable military reversals in ancient history. His campaigns between 622 and 628 struck deep into Persian territory, defeated Persian armies repeatedly, and forced a peace that returned all the conquered territories. It was one of the great military comebacks in recorded history. It was also, in a cruel irony, nearly irrelevant. While Heraclius was fighting the Persians, a new force was forming in the Arabian Peninsula. The Prophet Muhammad had unified the Arab tribes under a new faith, and the armies that carried Islam out of Arabia, beginning in 632, moved with a speed and military effectiveness that the exhausted Byzantine and Persian empires could not match. Persia collapsed within a decade. Byzantine, Egypt, Syria, and Palestine, recovered from Persia at such cost, fell to Arab armies by the 640s. Constantinople itself was threatened. Arab fleets attacked the city in 674 to 678 and again in 717 to 718. Both times, the city survived, and both times, the weapon that made the decisive difference was something the Arab attackers had no answer for: Greek fire. What exactly Greek fire was remains one of the genuine mysteries of military history. Byzantine sources describe a substance projected from tubes mounted on ships that burned on water, that water could not extinguish, and that inflicted terrible burns on contact. Arab accounts of their naval defeats describe fleets destroyed by burning liquid that seemed to pursue ships across the water. The formula was a state secret, guarded with an intensity that reflects how completely the Byzantines understood that this weapon was keeping them alive. It was reportedly known only to a small number of people at any given time, passed from emperor to emperor under oath of secrecy. Modern historians and chemists have proposed various reconstructions. naphtha or crude petroleum, quicklime, and other flammable compounds are among the most frequently cited candidates. Based on the described properties of burning on water and intensifying when water was applied, no surviving source provides the actual formula. The secret, it seems, was genuinely kept. What is not in doubt is the effect. The Arab siege of 674 to 678 ended with the destruction of a major Arab fleet. The siege of 717 to 718, one of the largest military operations the early Islamic Caliphate ever mounted, was broken partly by Greek fire and partly by the intervention of the Bulgarian ruler Tervel, who attacked the Arab army from the rear. Constantinople had survived. The advance into Europe through the Bosphorus had been stopped. The empire that emerged from those sieges was smaller than Justinian's, its great territories in Egypt and Syria gone, its population reduced by plague and war. But it was still there. The Hagia Sophia still stood. The walls still held. And a new crisis was forming inside the city, not from an external enemy, but from inside the churches, from a dispute about images that would shake the Byzantine world to its foundations and set in motion consequences still visible in the 21st century. Chapter 5. Schism, Heresy and the City at War with Itself. In the year 726 of the Common Era, soldiers acting on orders from the Emperor Leo III climbed to the Chalke Gate, the main ceremonial entrance to the imperial palace in Constantinople, and began removing a large gilded mosaic image of Christ that had hung there for generations. A crowd gathered as the soldiers worked. The crowd understood what was happening and what it meant. When the soldiers moved to take down the icon, people in the crowd tried to physically stop them. In the struggle that followed, some of the soldiers were killed. The emperor had those responsible executed. That exchange of violence, at a palace gate in the heart of the greatest Christian city in the world, opened one of the most destructive periods in Byzantine history. The Iconoclast controversy, the battle over whether Christian images should be venerated or destroyed, lasted with interruptions from 726 to 843 of the Common Era, more than a century of persecution, exile, execution, and destruction that divided the Byzantine Church and state so completely that some historians argue the empire never fully recovered. To understand why the question of images produced this level of violence, you have to understand what icons meant in Byzantine religious culture. By the 7th century, painted images of Christ, the Virgin Mary, and the saints had become central to Byzantine Christian practice in ways that had no precise precedent in the earlier church. They were present in churches, in homes, on city walls, on military standards. Soldiers went into battle carrying icons. Dying people held them. The icon was understood not simply as a representation of a holy person, but as a genuine point of contact with the divine. A place where the spiritual reality of the person depicted was present and accessible. For those who held this understanding, destroying an icon was not vandalism. It was something closer to an assault on the sacred itself. Leo III, and those who agreed with him, held a different view. They argued that the veneration of images was a form of idolatry, a violation of the biblical prohibition against worshipping graven images, They pointed to Arab military successes and argued that God was withholding favor because the church had fallen into idolatrous practices. They believed, genuinely, that reform required the removal of images that had become objects of superstitious attachment rather than genuine Christian devotion. The theological arguments on both sides were sophisticated and seriously held. This was not a conflict between the educated and the ignorant. Both sides included people of genuine faith and genuine intellectual capacity. The violence came from people who disagreed about something they both believed to be of ultimate importance, who had access to imperial power as a tool for enforcing their position, and who lived in a political culture where theological disagreement and political conflict were inseparable. The Emperor Constantine V, who reigned from 741 to 775, pursued the iconoclast program with a thoroughness that made his father Leo's initial actions look restrained. Monasteries were closed. Monks were forced to marry under penalty of punishment. The monk, Stephen the Younger, was killed in Constantinople in 764 after defying imperial orders. His death, described in accounts written by the icon-venerating tradition as martyrdom, the persecution was real and severe enough to drive large numbers of monks and clergy out of the capital. The controversy moved through two distinct phases. The first iconoclasm lasted from 726 to 787, ending when the Empress Irene, acting as regent for her son, convened the Second Council of Nicaea, which restored the veneration of icons and condemned iconoclasm as heresy. Irene subsequently had her own son blinded and deposed and ruled alone under the masculine title of emperor. She is the only person in Byzantine history to do so. A woman who navigated one of the most dangerous political environments in the ancient world to become its sole ruler, and who deserves more attention than she typically receives. The second iconoclasm lasted from 815 to 843 of the Common Era. It ended with the restoration of icons on the first Sunday of Lent, a date the Eastern Orthodox Church still celebrates annually as the triumph of orthodoxy. The icons were restored, but across the 117 years of intermittent conflict, something had changed in the relationship between Constantinople and Rome that no council decree could repair. The popes of Rome had condemned iconoclasm from its beginning. Leo III had responded to papal opposition by seizing papal estates in southern Italy and transferring ecclesiastical jurisdiction over the Balkan churches from Rome to Constantinople. The relationship between the two great centers of Western Christianity, already strained by generations of theological and jurisdictional disagreement, was becoming actively hostile. The underlying issues went beyond images. Rome argued for a supremacy of authority over the entire church based on the Apostle Peter's role as the first bishop of Rome. Constantinople argued for a primacy of honor rather than authority. They disagreed about the wording of the Nicene Creed, the foundational statement of Christian belief. The Western Church had added a phrase, known in Latin as the Filioque, meaning "and from the Son," to the statement about the Holy Spirit. The Eastern Church regarded this as an unauthorized alteration of a text that only an ecumenical council could legitimately change. These disputes came to a head in 863 to 867 in a conflict between Pope Nicholas I and Patriarch Photius of Constantinople, involving competing claims over jurisdiction in the newly Christianized Bulgarian kingdom, and the question of the Filioque. The conflict produced mutual condemnations and a formal breakdown of relations between the two churches that was patched over temporarily but never resolved at its root. The Photian Schism was a rehearsal for what came in 1054 of the Common Era. That year is usually fixed to July 16th, when Cardinal Humbert, representing a pope who had actually died 3 months earlier, walked into the Hagia Sophia during a service and placed a bull of excommunication on the altar. The bull excommunicated Patriarch Michael Cerularius of Constantinople. Cerularius responded by excommunicating the papal legates. The mutual excommunications of 1054 did not immediately divide the Christian world into two separate institutions. The split had been building for centuries, and the events of that July were as much symptom as cause. What they formalized was a division between a Western Christianity centered on Rome, conducting its theology in Latin, claiming papal supremacy, and including the Filioque in the Creed, and an Eastern Christianity centered on Constantinople, conducting its theology in Greek, insisting on conciliar decision-making, and maintaining the original creed unchanged. The mutual excommunications were formally lifted in 1965. After more than 900 years, the theological differences that produced them have not been resolved. The building where Humbert placed his excommunication has since been a mosque, then a museum, and is now a mosque again. The patriarch who received it has been dead for 1,000 years. The split he was part of continues. But for Constantinople's physical history, the consequences of the Great Schism were more immediate and more catastrophic than any theological document would suggest. The division between Eastern and Western Christianity meant that when Constantinople faced its greatest external crisis, the Western Church was not simply distracted or unable to help. It was an institution with complicated feelings about the city it might otherwise have defended. Because of what had happened in 1054, and because of what Western soldiers were about to do in 1204, the Crusaders were coming, and when they arrived, they would accomplish something that no Arab fleet, no Persian army, no Bulgarian siege, and no Viking raid had managed in 7 centuries of trying. They would sack Constantinople, not the enemies of Christendom, the Crusaders themselves. Chapter 6. The Crusaders sack their own allies. There is a moment in Constantinople's history that stops you when you encounter it fully. Not the fall of the city to the Ottomans in 1453, which was a military defeat by an external enemy after a heroic defense. The kind of ending that history has a grammar for. This other moment has no grammar. It is an act of collective violence dressed in the language of holy purpose, carried out by men who called themselves soldiers of Christ against the largest Christian city in the world. The year was 1204. The perpetrators were the armies of the Fourth Crusade. We know what happened in those 3 days in April largely because one man survived it, watched it with his own eyes, and wrote it down with the controlled fury of someone witnessing something that exceeds the vocabulary available to describe it. Niketas Choniates was a Byzantine official and historian, a man of considerable education and political experience who had served at the imperial court for years before the catastrophe. When the Crusaders breached the walls and flooded into the city, Choniates escaped through the burning streets with his family, helped by a Venetian friend who sheltered them in his home and then helped them flee. He eventually reached safety in Nicaea, in western Anatolia, where the Byzantine court in exile had established itself. There he wrote, "His account of 1204 is not the dispassionate chronicle of a man at safe remove from events. It is the testimony of a witness who watched his civilization be violated and who understood, with terrible clarity, what had been lost." His chronicle describes soldiers riding horses through the nave of the Hagia Sophia. It describes the great silver iconostasis being broken apart for its metal content. It describes the sacred vessels carried off by men who moments before had been receiving communion in the name of the same Christ depicted in the mosaics above them. Choniates was a hostile witness, with his own reasons to emphasize the enormity of what had been done, and historians read his most vivid details with that context in mind. But the core of what his chronicle describes, the systematic plunder and the desecration of the city's most sacred spaces, is confirmed across multiple sources, including Latin ones written by participants on the other side. He wrote these things not to produce sensation, but because he believed the world needed to know what had been done and by whom. He was right about that. The world did need to know. It is still worth knowing. To understand how the Crusaders arrived at this moment, you have to begin not with villainy but with a series of decisions, each of which seemed defensible at the time, that accumulated into something no individual decision-maker had intended or imagined. The crusading movement began with genuine religious impulse. When Pope Urban II preached the First Crusade at the Council of Clermont in 1095 of the Common Era, he was responding partly to an appeal from the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, who needed military assistance against the Seljuk Turks that had devastated Byzantine Anatolia after their victory at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071. What Alexios wanted was professional soldiers who would fight under Byzantine command for pay. What he got was a popular movement of a scale and intensity that no one had anticipated. The First Crusade achieved its stated objective. Jerusalem fell to the Crusaders in 1099. A Latin kingdom was established in the Holy Land. The relationship between Constantinople and the Crusaders from the beginning was one of profound mutual incomprehension, shading into active suspicion. The Byzantines wanted the Crusaders to pass through quickly, swear loyalty, and ideally return conquered territory to Byzantine sovereignty. The Crusaders regarded the Byzantines as treacherous, insufficiently martial, and theologically compromised. The Byzantines regarded the Crusaders as violent, undisciplined, and dangerously unpredictable. Both assessments contained enough accuracy to prevent genuine cooperation at any point. The Fourth Crusade began in 1201 with apparently clear objectives. The campaign would travel by sea to Egypt, strike at the Muslim power base at its source, and recover Jerusalem. The Venetians would provide the ships. The Crusaders would pay for them. The problem was money. The number of Crusaders who arrived in Venice was far smaller than expected, and the funds they brought far short of what they owed. The Venetians who held the contracts were led by Enrico Dandolo, the Doge of Venice, a man in his 90s who was nearly or entirely blind, who had spent decades as a diplomat and administrator before becoming Doge, and who understood the interests of Venice with a precision that made him one of the most formidable negotiators of his century. Dandolo proposed a solution. The Crusaders would work off part of their debt by helping Venice recover the port city of Zara on the Adriatic coast, which had transferred its loyalty to the King of Hungary. Zara was a Christian city. The King of Hungary was himself a crusader. Pope Innocent III explicitly prohibited the attack. The Crusaders attacked Zara anyway and took it. They found themselves excommunicated by the Pope whose banner they carried. Ad Zara. An embassy arrived from a young Byzantine prince named Alexios Angelos, whose father Isaac II had been deposed and blinded by his own brother. The current emperor, the young Alexios, made an offer: help him recover his father's throne, and he would pay an enormous sum, resolving the Crusaders' debt to Venice. Reunify the Eastern and Western churches under papal authority, and provide military support for the Egyptian campaign. The offer was almost certainly beyond what Alexios could deliver. The money he promised exceeded what the Byzantine treasury actually held. Church reunion was not something a Byzantine emperor could impose on a population that would not accept it. But the Crusaders were in debt, excommunicated, and looking for a way to salvage an enterprise that had not yet begun. They sailed to Constantinople in 1203. The Emperor Alexios III, confronted by a Crusader fleet in the Bosphorus and his nephew's claim to the throne, took the imperial treasury and fled. The young Alexios was installed as co-emperor alongside his father. Released from prison, the Crusaders camped outside the walls and waited for the promised payments. The payments never came. The money did not exist in the quantities promised. Church reunion remained politically impossible in Constantinople, where hostility to the Latin Church ran deep and where the memory of generations of theological conflict made any concession to Rome feel like betrayal. The young emperor found himself trapped between Crusaders demanding payment and a population that regarded every concession to the Latins as proof that he had sold them out. A palace official named Alexios Doukas led a coup, deposed and murdered the young Alexios, and was proclaimed emperor. He had no intention of paying the Crusaders. The previous agreement was, from his perspective, void. The Crusades' leaders faced a choice: accept that the Byzantine venture had failed and sail to Egypt, or take by force what diplomacy had not delivered. They chose force. The first assault on the walls on April 6th of 1204 failed. The sea walls, even in their partially deteriorated state, repulsed the attacking fleet. The second assault came on April 12th. Venetian ships, using scaling bridges mounted on their masts to span the gap between the vessels and the walls, gained a foothold on the sea wall. Soldiers poured through. The Byzantine forces, demoralized and poorly led by an emperor who had himself seized power only weeks before, collapsed. The city that had held against Arab fleets, Bulgarian armies, and every other force that had reached its walls across 8 centuries fell in a single day to men who had departed Western Europe under the sign of the cross. What followed was 3 days of systematic plunder. Churches were stripped of their accumulated treasures. The great bronze statues that had adorned Constantinople since the time of Constantine were melted down for their metal content. Ancient works of sculpture representing centuries of Greek and Roman artistic achievement were destroyed in hours. Imperial tombs were opened. Libraries were dispersed or destroyed. The 4 gilded bronze horses that stand today inside the Basilica of San Marco in Venice, among the finest surviving works of ancient sculpture, were removed from the Hippodrome of Constantinople in 1204 and shipped to Venice. Napoleon took them to Paris in 1797 after conquering Venice. They were returned to Venice after his defeat, under the terms agreed in 1815. The originals are now inside the basilica for preservation, with replicas on the facade. When you look at those horses in Venice, you are looking at what Constantinople lost, the Latin Empire of Constantinople, established after the sack, lasted until 1261, when the Byzantine Emperor Michael VIII Palaiologos retook the city while the Latin forces were occupied elsewhere. The Byzantine Empire was restored. But the empire restored in 1261 was a ghost of what had existed before. The treasury was empty. The population had fallen dramatically. The territorial base had shrunk. The administrative capacity had been disrupted in ways that took decades to partially repair, and something harder to quantify had been broken. The confidence that had sustained Byzantine civilization through centuries of external pressure, the conviction that Constantinople was protected, that its walls were inviolable, that the civilization it embodied could survive anything, had been shattered by men carrying Christian crosses, not by the infidel, by people who shared the faith, or claimed to. The wound ran deeper than any military defeat because it was not a military defeat in the conventional sense. It was a betrayal, and the Byzantine memory of 1204 was a live wound, not a historical event, in a way that has no equivalent in the Latin Christian memory of the same period. There is one more consequence that matters for the rest of Constantinople's story. Every subsequent Byzantine emperor who attempted to negotiate church reunion with Rome in exchange for Western military assistance against the growing Ottoman threat faced the same obstacle. The population would not accept it, not primarily because of the theology, though the theology mattered, because of 1204, because of the horses removed from the hippodrome and Niketas Choniates escaping through burning streets with his family. When the Ottomans came, Constantinople faced them largely alone. 1204 had made certain of that. Chapter 7. The Long, Twilight Ottoman Rise and Byzantine Collapse. There is a particular kind of tragedy that history produces rarely and that is harder to witness than sudden catastrophe. It is the tragedy of slow ending, a civilization that can see what is coming, that understands with increasing clarity what the final outcome will be, that tries everything available to prevent it and finds that nothing works, and that continues to produce art and scholarship and political argument and theological disputation. All the ordinary business of civilization, in the full knowledge of an approaching end that everyone can see and no one can stop. That is the story of Constantinople between 1261 and 1453. Nearly 2 centuries of diminishment, 2 centuries of an empire that kept calling itself Roman, kept performing the rituals of imperial power, kept claiming a dignity that its actual territorial and military situation could no longer support, and kept finding, each decade, that it was smaller and weaker and more alone than it had been before. When Michael VIII Palaiologos retook Constantinople from the Latin Empire in 1261, the city he recovered was a ruin of what it had been. The population had fallen from perhaps 400,000 before 1204 to something between 100,000 and 150,000, and it would continue to fall. Entire neighborhoods within the great Theodosian walls were abandoned. returned to vegetable gardens and open ground. Travelers who visited Constantinople in the late Byzantine period consistently remarked on the strange quality of a great city gone hollow. Its walls still enclosing an enormous perimeter, but much of that perimeter empty. Its magnificent buildings standing amid vacant lots and silence. The physical contraction was visible evidence of imperial contraction. The empire Michael restored was not the empire that had existed before 1204. It was smaller, poorer, more contested, and surrounded by enemies on every side who understood that the patient was declining and that the right moment for a decisive move would eventually arrive. To the west, the ambitions of the restored Latin powers threatened another Western assault on Constantinople. Michael spent enormous diplomatic energy managing this threat, including an attempt to reunify the churches at the Second Council of Lyon in 1274, offering Rome the ecclesiastical prize that Western Christendom had wanted since the Great Schism. The Byzantine clergy and population rejected it so completely that Michael's son Andronikos II had to formally repudiate the agreement after his father's death in 1282. The pattern had established itself and would not change. The emperor could sign. The people would not follow. The memory of 1204 was too present, too raw, too real. To the north, the Bulgarians and Serbs were expanding into Byzantine territory in the Balkans. The Serbian ruler Stefan Dušan, who reigned from 1331 to 1355, built a state that at its height controlled most of what is now Serbia, North Macedonia, Albania, and northern Greece. He styled himself Emperor of the Serbs and Greeks, and had genuine ambitions toward Constantinople itself. His death in 1355 removed one specific threat, but the territorial losses his campaigns produced were permanent. To the east, a new power was taking shape in the Anatolian plateau. On territory the Seljuk Turks had taken from the Byzantines after Manzikert, and that subsequent political fragmentation had divided into small competing principalities, each looking for opportunities to expand. One of these principalities was founded by a man named Ertugrul somewhere in the mid-13th century. In a small territory in northwestern Anatolia near the Byzantine frontier, Ertugrul's son Osman expanded it through military skill and political intelligence, attracting fighters and administrators from across the Turkish world. By the time Osman died, around 1324, he had given his name to a dynasty, the Osmanli, which Europeans would call Ottoman, would become one of the most powerful empires in the history of the world. The early Ottoman expansion targeted Byzantine weakness with precision. Orhan, Osman's Som, took Bursa in 1326, making it the first Ottoman capital. Nicaea, where Constantine had presided over the Great Council of the Church, fell in 1331. Nicomedia fell in 1337. Within 2 decades of Osman's death, the Ottomans controlled most of northwestern Anatolia, the territory closest to Constantinople. The Byzantine response to this existential threat combined desperate diplomacy with self-destructive civil war in a combination that is painful to contemplate in hindsight. The Civil War of 1341 to 1347 between John V Palaiologos and John VI Cantacuzénos consumed the empire's remaining military and financial resources at precisely the moment when those resources needed to be directed outward. Both men had genuine claims to imperial authority. Both used every available tool to prosecute their conflict, including Ottoman military assistance. John Cantacuzenos invited Ottoman forces into Europe to support his claim, offering his daughter Theodora in marriage to the Ottoman Sultan Orhan. The Ottomans came into Europe, saw what was there, and did not forget. In 1347, the Black Death arrived in Constantinople. The plague that struck the city was part of the same pandemic that would kill between a third and half of Europe's population over the following decade. Constantinople, as a major trading hub with connections to the Black Sea ports where the plague had entered the Mediterranean world, was hit early and hard. The population, already dramatically reduced from its medieval heights, fell further. Civil war, Ottoman expansion, Balkan losses, Plage. By the 1350s, the empire that called itself Roman controlled little more than the city of Constantinople itself, a few coastal towns in Greece, and the Peloponnese Peninsula in the south. Everything else was gone. What remained was a city without an empire, an emperor without an army, an institution without resources. And here is the paradox that scholars return to repeatedly, and that makes this period so strange and so moving. The 14th and 15th centuries were, in political and military terms, a period of accelerating disaster. They were also, in intellectual and artistic terms, among the richest in Byzantine history. The theologian Gregory Palamas developed a sophisticated mystical theology centered on the concept of theosis, the participation of human beings in the divine energies, that remains foundational to Eastern Orthodox spirituality today. Artists working in Constantinople and Thessaloniki produced mosaics and frescoes of extraordinary quality. The Chora Church in Constantinople being the most celebrated surviving example. Its mosaics depicting biblical scenes with an emotional directness and compositional sophistication that art historians regard as genuinely revolutionary. And then there was Gemistos Plethon. Plethon was a philosopher born in Constantinople around 1355, who spent most of his adult life in the city of Mistras in the Peloponnese, the last significant cultural center of the dying empire. He was a man of extraordinary intellectual range, by the standards of his time and place. Extraordinary intellectual courage. He revived serious engagement with the ancient Greek philosophers, particularly Plato. At a time when Byzantine intellectual culture was dominated by theology and Aristotelian logic, he proposed, in works that scandalized his contemporaries, a return to a form of Platonic religious philosophy that many regarded as barely distinguishable from paganism. In 1438 and 1439, the aging Plethon traveled to Florence as part of the Byzantine delegation to the Council of Florence, the last great attempt to reunify the Eastern and Western churches. He was in his 80s. He had perhaps 12 to 15 years to live, and the Italian humanists who encountered him were transformed by the experience. Picture the scene. A man in his 80s, a subject of an empire that controlled barely more than a single city, arriving in one of the wealthiest and most intellectually vibrant cities in Europe, and proceeding to introduce an entire generation of Italian scholars to a body of ancient Greek thought they had known only in fragments and at second hand. Cosimo de' Medici, the patriarch of the Medici family and the most powerful patron of learning in 15th century Europe, reportedly attended Plethon's lectures and was so impressed that he founded the Platonic Academy of Florence partly as a result of the encounter. The Platonic Academy of Florence would become one of the primary vehicles through which ancient Greek philosophy entered the intellectual mainstream of Renaissance Europe. The ideas that Platon carried from a dying empire to a rising one rippled forward through Marsilio Ficino, through Pico della Mirandola, through the entire tradition of Renaissance Platonism, and into the intellectual foundations of the modern Western world. A civilization at the end of its political life was scattering seeds that would flower elsewhere. And few examples of that scattering are more vivid than an 80-year-old philosopher from a city that had perhaps 20 years left to exist, lecturing to the future of European thought in a Florentine hall. The Council of Florence itself was, for the Byzantine delegation, a transaction of desperate necessity. The Emperor John VIII Palaiologos had travelled to Italy hoping to secure Western military assistance against the Ottomans in exchange for church reunion. He signed the reunion agreement. He returned to Constantinople to find it rejected by the clergy and population with a ferocity that made implementation impossible. A prominent official reportedly said he would rather see the Ottoman turban in Constantinople than the Latin mitre. He was expressing a sentiment that much of the population shared. The Ottomans continued their expansion regardless. Murad II, who became Sultan in 1421, laid siege to Constantinople in 1422. The siege failed. The walls held, but failure to take the city did not diminish Ottoman power. Murad took Thessaloniki, the empire's second city. In 1430, the trajectory was clear to everyone watching. When Murad died in 1451 and was succeeded by his son Mehmed II, the new sultan was 21 years old. He had been studying Constantinople for years, reading Byzantine historians in Greek, analyzing the defenses that had defeated every previous attacker, identifying the technical problem that had stopped them all. The Byzantine emperor who would face him was Constantine the 11th Palaiologos, who had come to the throne in 1449. He was 53 years old, experienced, courageous, and operating without the resources that courage requires to succeed. His treasury was empty. His army numbered in the thousands. His appeals to the West had produced a trickle of Genoese and Venetian volunteers. But nothing approaching what could stop what was coming. Constantine the 11th. Pause on that name. The man who had founded Constantinople was Constantine I. The man standing on its walls as it fell would be Constantine the 11th. The city that began with Constantine would end with Constantine. History does not often arrange its symmetries this neatly, and no novelist would dare invent one so complete. Outside the walls, Mehmed was preparing with a thoroughness that went beyond anything previous Ottoman commanders had brought to bear on the city. He built a fortress on the European shore of the Bosphorus, Rumeli Hisari, giving him complete control of the strait. He assembled an army that historians estimate, drawing on multiple sources, at somewhere between 60,000 and 80,000 men, though contemporary Byzantine accounts placed the number significantly higher. He commissioned a Hungarian engineer named Urban, who had first offered his services to Constantine the 11th and been turned away for lack of funds, to construct the largest cannon that had yet been built. Urban had originally approached the Byzantine emperor. Constantine could not pay him. Mehmed could. The man who might have defended the city ended up providing the weapon that would breach its walls. That detail is almost too painful to dwell on, but it is historical fact. The 53 days that ended an empire were about to begin. Chapter 8. The 53 days that ended an empire. On the 5th of April, 1453, the Ottoman army appeared before the walls of Constantinople. Stand on what remains of the Theodosian walls today. The great triple defensive line that still runs for roughly 4 miles across the peninsula from the Golden Horn to the Sea of Marmara. And try to hold in your mind what the defenders saw that morning. The Ottoman encampment stretched across the entire width of the peninsula and beyond. The smoke of cooking fires rose across the horizon. The sound of drums and military instruments carried across the open ground between the armies. Inside the walls, the defending force numbered somewhere between 7,000 and 8,000 men, of whom perhaps 2,000 were foreign volunteers, primarily Genoese and Venetian soldiers whose presence reflected a mixture of genuine solidarity and the commercial reality that Constantinople's fall would be very bad for their trading interests in the eastern Mediterranean. 7,000 against 70,000, ancient walls against cannon, a civilization at the end of its resources against an empire at the beginning of its power. The mathematics were clear to everyone on both sides. What was not clear, and what would remain uncertain until the very end, was whether mathematics was the only thing that mattered. Mehmed II established his headquarters roughly 4 miles from the walls, in a red and gold tent flying his personal standard, from which he could observe the entire defensive perimeter. He was 21 years old. He had spent years thinking about this city, reading its history, studying its defenses, identifying the specific technical problem that had defeated every previous attacker. He spoke Greek. He had read Byzantine historians in their original language. He understood what Constantinople represented not just as a military objective, but as a symbolic prize whose capture would establish Ottoman supremacy beyond any argument. Urban's great cannon was the technical answer to the problem the walls had posed for 1,000 years. The weapon, which historians estimate could fire stone projectiles of several hundred pounds or more based on contemporary accounts that vary in their specifics, required a crew of hundreds to operate and approximately 3 hours to reload between shots. The barrel overheated with use and had to be cooled between firings. By any measure of battlefield efficiency, it was a cumbersome instrument. But when it fired against the Theodosian walls, it struck with a force those walls had never been designed to absorb. The walls had been built to resist catapult stones and battering rams and the kinetic energy that human muscle could generate. What Urban's cannon delivered was categorically different in scale. Sections of wall that had stood for 1,000 years began to crack and collapse. The defenders repaired them at night, using timber and earth and whatever material was available, filling the gaps that each day's bombardment created. They worked through darkness in shifts, knowing that morning would bring the cannon again. The rhythm of the siege settled into a pattern. Bombardment during daylight, repair through the night, another day of bombardment, another night of repair, week after week. The man commanding the most effective portion of the defense was not Byzantine. He was Giovanni Giustiniani Longo, a Genoese military commander who had arrived in Constantinople in January 1453 with approximately 700 soldiers and a reputation as one of the finest defensive commanders in the Mediterranean world. Constantine XI immediately recognized his value and gave him command of the critical central section of the land walls, directly opposite Mehmed's main camp where the heaviest bombardment was concentrated. Justinian held that section for nearly 7 weeks against a force many times his own. His handling of the defense, coordinating the repair crews, maintaining morale, organizing the counterattacks that prevented Ottoman forces from exploiting the breaches, was impressive enough that even Ottoman sources acknowledged it. On the water, the situation was more complicated. The Golden Horn had been blocked by a great chain stretched across its entrance, preventing the Ottoman fleet from attacking the sea walls from that direction. The Byzantine and Allied naval forces defending the chain held it successfully in the siege's early weeks, and in a remarkable engagement in mid-April managed to defeat an Ottoman naval attack. Mehmed responded with an audacity that has impressed military historians ever since. He ordered his fleet transported overland. In a logistical operation planned with meticulous care and executed over a single night, Ottoman engineers constructed a roadway of greased logs across the hill of Galata north of the Golden Horn and pulled approximately 70 ships on wheeled cradles over the hill and into the Golden Horn on the other side. When dawn came on April 22nd, the defenders on the Golden Horn sea walls looked out to find an Ottoman fleet already inside the harbour. The psychological impact was enormous. The one direction from which the city had felt relatively secure now contained an enemy fleet. The defending forces, already stretched thin across miles of walls, had to spread further to cover a new front. Through late April and early May, Mehmed launched multiple assaults. Each was repulsed. The defenders, despite their exhaustion and diminishing supplies, despite the knowledge that no relief fleet was coming from the west, a small vessel sent out through the blockade returned in early May with devastating news that Venice had dispatched nothing. Held. There were negotiations. Mehmed sent envoys offering terms. If Constantinople surrendered peacefully, the population would be spared, property respected, the right to worship protected. Constantine's reply, according to the sources available, was that he was willing to pay tribute, to cede territory, to make almost any concession short of the surrender of the city itself. He would not surrender the city. His refusal was not simply pride. It was the product of theology and history combined into something that made surrender literally unthinkable for him personally. Constantinople was the capital of the Roman Empire, the empire of the Christian God, the city that God had protected for 1,000 years. To surrender, it was not a military decision. It was a statement about the world, about God's relationship to his people, about the meaning of everything this place represented. Constantine would not make that statement. The final assault came in the early hours of Tuesday, the 29th of May, 1453. Mehmed had been preparing it for days, resting his troops, making the calculations that told him the walls could not be indefinitely repaired and the defenders could not indefinitely maintain their intensity. He ordered the assault to begin around 1:30 in the morning, under cover of darkness, with the intention of overwhelming exhausted defenders before dawn. The Ottoman forces attacked along the entire perimeter simultaneously. The primary assault drove at the central section of the land walls, where the cannon had done the most damage. Wave after wave of soldiers were sent forward. The initial waves composed of irregular forces whose purpose was as much to exhaust the defenders as to breach the walls. For the first hours, the walls held. The system that had been holding for 7 weeks held again through the darkness. Then 2 things happened in rapid succession that decided everything. Giovanni Giustiniani Longo was struck by a projectile that penetrated his armor and wounded him severely. The wound was not immediately fatal, but Giustiniani, in intense pain and possibly recognizing the severity of his condition, asked Constantine to open a gate in the inner wall so that he could be carried to a ship for medical treatment. Constantine reportedly begged him to stay. Giustiniani went. His departure from the wall produced exactly the effect that the departure of any commander produces in a force under extreme pressure. The men who had been fighting under his direction lost cohesion at precisely the moment when the assault was reaching its greatest intensity. The second event was the discovery of a small gate in the inner wall, the Cercoporta, that had been left unsecured, possibly by defenders who had been using it for sorties and failed to properly close it in the chaos of the night assault. Ottoman soldiers found it, understood what it was, and poured through. Within minutes, Ottoman soldiers were inside the inner wall. The cry that the city had fallen spread along the walls and through the streets and into the churches where civilians had gathered through the night to pray. What remained of the defending force collapsed. Constantine, the 11th Palaiologos, the last emperor of the Roman Empire, pulled off his imperial regalia, threw it aside, drew his sword, and walked toward the Ottoman soldiers flooding through the breach. The Byzantine and Genoese soldiers beside him did the same. No body identified as Constantine's was ever recovered with certainty. The tradition that formed in the immediate aftermath holds that he died fighting, cut down somewhere in the mass of bodies near the breach. The Ottomans, who would have had every reason to identify and display the body of the last Byzantine emperor as confirmation of their victory, apparently could not find it. A man who had removed his imperial insignia before his final charge would have been indistinguishable from any other fallen defender. Constantine the 11th, the last emperor of Rome, died as he had lived the final years of his reign, with a dignity that the circumstances made extraordinary rather than simply adequate. Mehmed entered the city later that day. He went first to the Hagia Sophia. He ordered the Islamic call to prayer recited from the pulpit. He prostrated himself on the floor of the church and pressed his forehead to the marble. He then declared that the Hagia Sophia would become a mosque. The Ottoman historian Kritovoulos, whose account of Mehmed's reign historians consider generally reliable, records that Mehmed wept when he walked through the city and saw its state, the empty buildings, the abandoned streets, the physical evidence of a civilization at the end of its strength. He reportedly quoted a Persian verse about the spider keeping gates in the palace of Caesar and the owl calling from the towers of fallen kings. The conqueror wept for what he had conquered. Whether genuine emotion or calculated imperial theatre, it was a response that told you something about how Mehmed understood what had just happened. He had not simply won a battle, he had ended an age. He was 21 years old. The consequences of May 29th, 1453, rippled outward in every direction. The scholars who fled Constantinople before and during the fall carried manuscripts with them. Byzantine scholars had preserved enormous quantities of ancient Greek literature that had been lost in Western Europe during the centuries after Rome's collapse. Texts of Plato, Aristotle, Archimedes, Euclid, the great physicians and playwrights, known in the West only in partial translations or not at all. These texts arrived in Italy in Greek originals, carried by people fleeing for their lives, and contributed to the intellectual environment of the Italian Renaissance. The fall of Constantinople did not cause the Renaissance, which was already underway, but it accelerated aspects of it and provided materials that had not previously been available in the West. The fall also made the European search for alternative trade routes to Asia more urgent. Ottoman influence over the land and sea routes between the Mediterranean and the East made European merchants eager to find alternatives. The Portuguese exploration of the African coast, which produced Vasco da Gama's route to India in 1498, was partly motivated by the need to find a way around Ottoman-controlled territory. Columbus's voyage in 1492, sailing west in search of a route to Asia, was part of the same pattern of response to the same geopolitical reality. These are not small consequences. They are part of the long chain of causes that connects the events of May 29th. 1453 to the age of European exploration, and through that to the transformation of the world that followed. No historian would argue that a single day caused all of that, but that day was a hinge, a moment when the door of the world turned on its pivot and everything on the other side was different from what came before. Chapter 9. Ottoman, Istanbul, the center of the world. On the 1st of June, 1453, 3 days after the fall of Constantinople, Mehmed II issued a proclamation. He invited the people who had fled the city during the siege and its aftermath to return. He promised that their property would be respected, their right to worship protected, the city rebuilt and repopulated and made. Once again, a great capital. This was policy, not sentiment. Mehmed understood that an empty city was worth nothing, and that what had made Constantinople valuable across 2,000 years was not its walls or its churches or its cisterns. It was its position, and its position could generate wealth and power only if people were living there, trading there, making the city function. He also understood something that conquerors have often failed to grasp: the symbolic value of what he had taken, if used correctly, would multiply his power far beyond what military conquest alone could deliver. He began using it immediately. He declared himself Kaiser-i-Rum, Caesar of Rome. This was not a casual title. It was a claim of genuine imperial succession. Mehmed was presenting himself not as the destroyer of the Roman Empire, but as its inheritor, the legitimate continuation of a tradition the Byzantines had maintained for 1,000 years. He studied Byzantine history. He commissioned Byzantine scholars who remained in the city to write accounts of Roman history for his library. He maintained the Patriarchate of Constantinople, appointing a new patriarch and guaranteeing the Eastern Orthodox Church its institutional existence within his empire. The appointment of Gennadios Scholarios as the first patriarch of Constantinople under Ottoman rule in 1454 is one of the more remarkable events of the immediate aftermath. Gennadios was a theologian of genuine distinction who had opposed church reunion with Rome more fiercely than almost anyone. Mehmed personally interviewed him, found him impressive, and installed him in office with the full ceremony of the Orthodox patriarchal installation. The patriarch received from the Sultan's own hand the staff of office that Byzantine emperors had traditionally given to patriarchs. The symbolism was precise and deliberate. The Ottoman Sultan was performing the role of Roman emperor in the ceremony of patriarchal installation, taking on the imperial obligation to protect and support the church that Byzantine emperors had exercised for 1,000 years. That decision has had consequences extending to the present day. The Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople. The institution Mehmed guaranteed in 1454 still exists. Its patriarch still resides in Istanbul, in the Fener district on the Golden Horn. The direct institutional continuity from the Byzantine Patriarchate through the Ottoman centuries to the present is unbroken. When you consider that the institution Mehmed chose to preserve has now survived under Ottoman and then Turkish sovereignty for more than 570 years, his decision looks less like magnanimity and more like one of the shrewdest administrative choices in the history of empire. The physical rebuilding of the city began immediately. Mehmed used every available tool to bring people back. He ordered the settlement of craftsmen, merchants, and artisans from across the Ottoman Balkans and Anatolia in specific city neighborhoods. He granted tax exemptions to encourage voluntary migration. He invited Jewish communities that had been expelled from various European cities to settle in Constantinople, and they came in significant numbers. Establishing the Sephardic Jewish community, that would be a defining element of Istanbul's cultural life for centuries. Within a decade, the population was recovering. Within a generation, it had grown beyond its late Byzantine levels. By the end of the 15th century, Constantinople was again one of the largest cities in Europe. Mehmed then ordered the construction of what would become the defining complex of Ottoman Istanbul, Topkapi Palace. Begun in the 1450s and expanded by successive sultans over the following centuries, was not a single building but a complex of structures, courtyards, gardens, and pavilions spread across roughly 70 hectares on the tip of the Istanbul Peninsula, at the point where the Bosphorus met the Golden Horn and the Sea of Marmara. At its height, it housed between 3,000 and 4,000 people, including the Sultan's household, administrative staff, treasury, armory, libraries, and the harem. The harem of Topkapi Palace has accumulated an enormous weight of European fantasy and misrepresentation over the centuries. It was not primarily a space of sexual indulgence. Though the sexual dimension was real, it was, more precisely, a political institution. The women of the harem were educated in multiple languages, in music, in the administrative customs of the palace, in the arts of political navigation within one of the most complex courts in the world. The mothers of princes competed fiercely to position their sons for succession. The most powerful women in the harem, particularly the Valide Sultan, the mother of the reigning sultan, exercised political influence that extended far beyond the palace walls. The Venetian ambassadors stationed in Constantinople, whose reports to the Senate in Venice are among the most detailed surviving sources on the Ottoman court, wrote extensively about the political role of the Valide Sultan and her allies. These were not marginal figures. They were central actors in the governance of an empire. Mehmed commissioned a great mosque complex on the fourth hill of the city, on the site where the Church of the Holy Apostles, the second most important Byzantine church and the burial place of Byzantine emperors, including Constantine I, had stood. The church was demolished. The Fatih Mosque, the Conqueror's Mosque, was built in its place between 1463 and 1470. The complex incorporated a religious school, a hospital, a caravanserai, a bath, a soup kitchen that fed the poor, and a library. This model of the mosque as comprehensive social institution, the Kulliye, became the template for Ottoman urban development across the empire and transformed the character of Istanbul's neighborhoods over the following century. The great age of Ottoman mosque building in Istanbul reached its peak under Suleiman I, whom Europeans call the Magnificent and the Ottomans called the Lawgiver. And under the architect he commissioned to build his monument, Suleiman reigned from 1520 to 1566. His reign of 46 years represented the Ottoman Empire at the height of its territorial extent, military power, and cultural achievement. The empire stretched from Hungary in the northwest to the Persian frontier in the east, from the Crimea in the north to Yemen in the south. It included the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. He wrote poetry under the pen name Muhibbi. He reformed Ottoman law with a systematic intelligence that earned him the title the Lawgiver among his own people. And he commissioned Mimar Sinan. Sinan's story is remarkable. Born in Anatolia sometime around 1490, possibly of Christian origin, he was recruited into the Devshirme system, converted to Islam, and trained for imperial service. He became a military engineer, served on dozens of campaigns across 4 decades, and learned his craft in the most demanding practical school available. Appointed chief imperial architect sometime in the 1530s. He held the position for approximately 50 years until his death in 1588, at an age that sources estimate at between 90 and 100 years. In those 50 years, according to Ottoman records, Sinan designed and oversaw the construction of more than 300 structures across the empire, including 85 major mosques, 52 smaller mosques, 57 religious schools, 40 caravanserai, and dozens of other buildings. His masterpiece by his own account was the Selimiye Mosque in Edirne, where he claimed to have surpassed the structural achievement of the Hagia Sophia. The claim is debatable but not absurd. But for Istanbul's history and Istanbul's skyline, the building that matters most is the Süleymaniye Mosque, completed in 1557 on the third hill of the city overlooking the Golden Horn. It sits on its hill with a confidence that reflects the civilization that produced it, visible from the water for miles. Its 4 minarets rising in a silhouette that is still one of the defining images of the city. Suleiman is buried in a tomb in the Süleymaniye's garden. His wife, Hürrem Sultan, known in Europe as Roxilana, is buried in an adjoining tomb. Sinan is buried in a small tomb he designed for himself in the same garden complex. 3 of the people most responsible for the physical appearance of Istanbul as it exists today lie within a few hundred meters of where they did their most important work. Hürrem Sultan deserves more than a footnote, because her story illuminates both the possibilities and limits of power within the Ottoman system. She was born, according to most sources, in the Ruthenian region of what is now Ukraine, probably around 1500. She was captured, likely in a raid, entered the Ottoman slave system, and eventually reached the imperial harem. She attracted Suleiman's attention, rose to become his favored concubine, bore him several children, and then did something that had essentially no precedent in Ottoman imperial practice. She married him. The marriage of a sultan to a harem concubine was not simply unusual. Within the conventions of Ottoman court governance, it was nearly incomprehensible. The conventional wisdom held that a sultan should not marry, because a wife acquired legal rights and political standing that would complicate the management of succession. Suleiman married Hurrem anyway. Sometime in the 1520s, whether this reflected genuine love, Hurrem's extraordinary personal qualities, political calculation, or some combination of all three, the sources do not resolve. What is not in dispute is the outcome. Hurrem became the most politically influential woman in the Ottoman Empire for the rest of Suleiman's reign. She maintained correspondence with foreign rulers. She commissioned charitable foundations in Jerusalem, Mecca, and Istanbul. She influenced major appointments within the administration, and she successfully maneuvered to ensure that her own son would succeed to the throne rather than Suleiman's son by a previous concubine. The succession struggle she engineered ended with the execution of Suleiman's eldest son Mustafa in 1553, ordered by Suleiman on suspicion of rebellion. Mustafa was popular with the army and widely regarded as the most capable of Suleiman's sons. His execution remains deeply controversial in Ottoman historical memory. Suleiman died in 1566 in his tent on campaign in Hungary, having reigned for 46 years. Now step inside the Grand Bazaar. Not the Grand Bazaar of the tourist brochures, but the Grand Bazaar of 1566, at the height of Suleiman's empire. You enter through a gate, and immediately the world changes. The light drops, filtered through small domes overhead, each pierced with openings that cast shifting circles of daylight onto the stone floor below. The smell hits you first. Leather from the cobbler's section. Raw and sharp. Spices from the east. Cinnamon and pepper and cardamom layered one over another. Beeswax from the candle makers. The particular warmth of a crowd of thousands in an enclosed space. Voices in Turkish and Greek and Armenian and Ladino and Arabic and Venetian Italian, rising and overlapping in the particular acoustic of a covered stone market that turns commerce into a kind of music. The stalls extend in every direction. Over 60 streets of them. Thousands of individual merchants, each specializing in their own goods. Persian silk. Rolled and stacked in colors that have no equivalent in the wool-dominated wardrobe of a northern European. Egyptian cotton, the finest available. Gold and silver jewelry from workshops you can hear before you see. The tap of hammers on metal threading through the general noise. Ceramics from Iznik in the blue and white palette that will eventually give its name to a style of decoration recognized across 3 centuries and 4 continents. This is where the empire comes to exchange what it has gathered from 3 continents. This is what it looks and sounds and smells like when the center of the world is doing business. By the end of the 16th century, Istanbul was one of the great cities of the world, with a population that estimates place at between 200,000 and 400,000 people. larger than any city in Western Europe. London, at the same period, had perhaps 50,000 inhabitants. Paris, perhaps 150,000. But somewhere in the late 16th century, in ways not yet visible in the skyline, or the markets, or the reports of foreign ambassadors describing its magnificence, something was beginning to change. The age of European exploration that the fall of Constantinople had helped accelerate was slowly redirecting the flows of wealth that had made Istanbul so powerful. The Portuguese route around Africa to India, opened in 1498, gave European merchants access to Asian goods that bypassed the Ottoman commercial system entirely. The silver flowing into Spain from the Americas was beginning to inflate prices across the Mediterranean world, damaging the Ottoman economy in ways the administration was not yet equipped to understand or address. The Ottomans would not fall quickly. They had too much institutional depth, too much territorial breadth, for their problems to become catastrophic immediately. But the trajectory that would eventually produce the phrase, "the sick man of Europe," had its origins in these same decades of apparent splendor. The city at the center of the world was beginning, almost imperceptibly, its long journey toward the margins. Chapter 10. Splendor and Stagnation, the Ottoman Long Decline. There is a particular kind of city that exists only at the intersection of empires. Not a city that belongs to one civilization or one tradition, but a city where the languages of 4 continents are spoken on the same street, where a man can conduct business in Turkish in the morning, negotiate in French over lunch, and settle accounts in Greek in the afternoon, where the intelligence services of 6 European powers maintain safe houses within walking distance of each other, their agents occasionally aware of each other across the same cafe table, sometimes not. Istanbul in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries was that city. Understanding what it actually was requires setting aside the narrative of Ottoman decline, which is accurate as far as it goes, and looking at what was genuinely happening in the streets and coffee houses and embassies of one of the most cosmopolitan cities the world has ever produced. The decline was real. Let us be clear about that before we look past it. The Janissary Corps, the elite infantry force that had been the cutting edge of Ottoman military power for 2 centuries, had become by the 17th century something quite different from what it had been. The Devshirme system that originally recruited talented boys from Christian families converted them to Islam, and trained them for imperial service had been relaxed and then effectively abandoned, allowing the sons of existing janissaries to join the corps. They had been permitted to engage in trade, giving them economic interests that competed with their military function. They had become a hereditary military caste with enormous political power and a consistent pattern of using that power to resist any reform that threatened their privileges. A sultan who attempted to modernize the military found janissary cooking cauldrons overturned in the streets, the traditional Ottoman signal for military rebellion. Sultans were deposed by janissary revolts. Sultans were killed by them. The institution that had built the empire had become the primary obstacle to the reforms that might have allowed it to adapt. Financial pressures compounded the military ones. American silver flowing into the global economy through Spain produced price inflation across the Mediterranean world throughout the 17th century. Ottoman government revenues, fixed in nominal terms by long-standing agreements that the political system made difficult to revise, bought less and less in real terms. The costs of maintaining frontiers across an enormous empire kept rising. The gap between revenue and expenditure widened. The military turning point that most historians identify as the moment when Ottoman trajectory became unmistakable was the Second Siege of Vienna in 1683. The Ottoman army that reached Vienna in July of that year numbered perhaps 100,000 men under the Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa Pasha, a commander of genuine ability who had risen through the Ottoman system on merit. Vienna was the capital of the Habsburg Empire, the dominant land power in Central Europe. Its fall would have opened the Danube Valley to Ottoman expansion and transformed the political geography of Europe. What happened instead was that a relief army under the Polish king John III Sobieski arrived on the 12th of September, 1683, and attacked the Ottoman besieging forces. The battle lasted a single day. The Ottoman army, which had been conducting siege operations for 2 months and was not configured for a field engagement against a fresh force attacking from high ground, broke and fled. Kara Mustafa retreated to Belgrade, where he was executed by strangling on the Sultan's orders. His head was sent to Istanbul in a velvet bag. The defeat at Vienna was not simply a setback. It was the beginning of a territorial retreat that would continue for 2.5 centuries. The Treaty of Karlowitz in 1699 surrendered Hungary, Transylvania, and most of Slavonia to the Habsburgs. It was the first major territorial concession the empire had made to a Christian power, and it established a pattern that would repeat with painful regularity. But here is what the purely political narrative of Ottoman decline misses. Istanbul, in the 18th and 19th centuries, was simultaneously declining as an imperial power and flourishing as something else entirely, as a city of extraordinary cultural complexity that produced encounters and experiences available nowhere else on earth. Imagine walking from the Pera district, the hillside neighborhood above Galata where the foreign embassies and Levantine merchant communities were concentrated, down toward the waterfront on a morning in 1850. The streets you pass through contain the offices of European trading houses conducting business in a dozen languages. On the grander Rue the Pera, the main street lined with European-style buildings housing European banks, European hotels, European restaurants. You might encounter a Greek merchant, an Armenian banker, a Jewish factor, an Ottoman official, a British diplomat, and a Russian agent in the space of a single block, each conducting their own version of the city's essential business, which was the exchange of goods and information and influence at the meeting point of worlds. This was the Istanbul that Mark Twain encountered in 1867, on the journey he would describe in The Innocents Abroad. He found the mosques extraordinary, the streets bewildering, and the dogs ubiquitous, the semi-wild street dogs of Istanbul, which had lived in neighborhood packs for centuries, appeared in virtually every Western account of the city in this period. They remain in Istanbul today, now neutered and vaccinated by municipal programs, sleeping in doorways and on sidewalks with the comfortable ease of animals that know they belong. The same Istanbul was, in 1850, one of the central arenas of the great power competition historians call the Eastern Question. The question was simple to state and impossible to resolve. What happens to the Ottoman Empire when it finally collapses? Russia wanted the warm water ports of the Black Sea coast most urgently, control of the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles, British policy throughout the 19th century was therefore consistently oriented toward preserving enough Ottoman power to prevent Russian expansion. This calculation produced the Crimean War of 1853 to 1856, in which Britain and France allied with the Ottoman Empire against Russia. The war produced the Charge of the Light Brigade at Balaclava in 1854. One of the most famous military disasters in British history, it also produced something of more lasting consequence. Florence Nightingale arrived at the Selimiye barracks in Scutari, across the Bosphorus from Istanbul, in November 1854, with a team of nurses and a mandate to improve conditions in the British military hospital there. Picture the wards she walked into on her first day. Men lying on bare floors in their own filth. The stench so overwhelming that officers sometimes refused to enter. No clean water. No proper bandaging. No record keeping. No system of any kind for tracking patients or their conditions. The death rate in the facility was over 40%. And most of those dying were not dying from their wounds. They were dying from cholera, typhoid, and dysentery, from problems that were entirely preventable. Nightingale was a mathematician and statistician as well as a nurse, and she responded to what she saw not with horror alone, but with methodology. She implemented sanitation protocols. She organized supply chains. She created record-keeping systems where there had been none. She tracked outcomes in ways that allowed her to demonstrate, quantitatively, what was working and what was not. According to the records she kept, the death rate fell to under 2%. She did this in a military bureaucracy that actively resisted her at every stage, that regarded her presence as an improper intrusion into a masculine domain, that blocked her requests, denied her resources, and questioned her authority continuously. She persisted anyway, using the same statistical clarity with which she had documented the problem to document the resistance and present it to officials in London who could override the local obstruction. She is buried in Hampshire. The work that made her famous was done in Istanbul. The Ottoman response to the recognition of structural weakness was the Tanzimat, the reorganization, a period of reform beginning formally with the Gülhane Decree of 1839 and continuing through subsequent decades. Picture the moment that decree was read aloud in the rose garden of the Topkapi Palace. Officials in European-style frock coats standing alongside officials in traditional Ottoman robes. The very clothing, a visible argument about which direction the empire should face. The Tanzimat established formal equality before the law for all Ottoman subjects, regardless of religion. It reorganized the military on European models. It created secular courts alongside religious courts and new educational institutions modeled on European universities. The reforms were genuine but consistently incomplete, frequently reversed by political forces that benefited from the old system, and perpetually undermined by the same dynamics that had made reform difficult throughout the previous 2 centuries. The Janissary problem had actually been resolved by Sultan Mahmud II in 1826. With characteristic decisiveness, Mahmud had quietly built a new military force trained on European lines before making his move. When he announced the Janissary Corps' abolition, the Janissaries overturned their cauldrons and marched on the palace as they always had. This time, artillery loaded with grape shot was positioned around their barracks. The rebellion was suppressed in hours, several thousand janissaries were killed. The corps that had been making and unmaking sultans for 4 centuries was gone by noon. Mahmud called this the auspicious incident. But resolving the janissary problem could not resolve the deeper structural issues. By the late 19th century, those issues were becoming impossible to ignore. The Ottoman Empire was widely described as the sick man of Europe, a phrase attributed to Tsar Nicholas I of Russia in a conversation with the British ambassador around 1853. Whether Nicholas used those exact words is debated by historians. What is not debated is that the phrase captured how European diplomats understood the situation. The Ottoman Empire's entry into the First World War on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary in October 1914 was driven by the calculation made primarily by the Committee of Union and Progress. The Young Turk movement that had effectively seized control of the government after the revolution of 1908, that Germany was likely to win and that alliance with the probable victor offered the best chance of preserving and perhaps recovering Ottoman territory. The calculation was catastrophically wrong. Germany and Austria-Hungary lost. The Ottoman Empire found itself on the losing side of the most destructive war in human history to that point. Its armies defeated on multiple fronts. Its capital under the guns of an allied fleet anchored in the Bosphorus. The Treaty of Sèvres in 1920 proposed to partition what remained of the empire among the Allied powers. Leaving a small rump state in central Anatolia, the treaty was never implemented. A Turkish nationalist movement under Mustafa Kemal fought a war of independence that created the Republic of Turkey on different terms. But that story belongs to the next chapter. What belongs here is a recognition of what Istanbul had been through the long Ottoman centuries. Even in decline, it had been the place where East genuinely met West. Not as a tourist slogan, but as daily reality. It had been the city where Venetian merchants and Ottoman officials and Greek scholars and Jewish refugees and Armenian craftsmen and French diplomats and Russian agents all lived in proximity, conducting the business of their different worlds in the same streets and coffee houses and harbour taverns. That proximity produced something no single civilization could have generated alone. A culture of translation, in every sense of the word. A culture that had learned, over centuries of necessity, to move between languages and traditions and reference systems with a flexibility that was itself a form of achievement. The Istanbul that existed before the 20th century was many things simultaneously. Its loss, when it came, was felt differently by different communities. But it was a loss, and what replaced it was both more and less than what it had been. Chapter 11. The End of the Empire and the Birth of a Republic. On the 13th of October, 1923, the Grand National Assembly of Turkey voted to make Ankara the capital of the new Republic of Turkey. Istanbul, which had been capital of the Byzantine Empire for over 1,000 years and capital of the Ottoman Empire for nearly 500, was no longer a capital of anything. The vote was not unexpected. Mustafa Kemal had been moving the administrative machinery of the new state to Ankara for months, to a modest Anatolian city of perhaps 30,000 people, set in the middle of the plateau, far from the coast and far from the foreign warships that had been anchored in the Bosphorus since the armistice of 1918. But expected or not, the symbolic weight of the decision was enormous. Imagine a street scene in the Beyoğlu district in the early 1920s. The trams are still running. The shop signs are still in multiple scripts: Turkish in Arabic letters, Greek, Armenian. People are going about their business in the ordinary way of people who do not yet know that the world they inhabit is about to be reorganized around different principles. They look like inhabitants of a capital city. Within a few years, they would be inhabitants of a former capital. And the difference would be felt in ways both practical and profound. The ministries moving to Ankara took jobs and contracts and the particular energy of a place where decisions are made. What remained was still a great city, the largest in the country, the most cosmopolitan, the most historically weighted, but the center of gravity had shifted, and everyone in those streets would eventually feel it. To understand why Kemal made this choice, you have to understand what Istanbul represented in the political imagination of the Turkish nationalist movement he led. Istanbul was imperial. Its physical fabric spoke of a past that Kemal regarded as incompatible with the modern nation-state he was building. The Topkapi Palace, the great mosques, the sublime port where the Ottoman government had been housed. All of it was Ottoman in ways that were architectural and institutional and deeply embedded in daily life. Istanbul was also cosmopolitan in ways that Turkish nationalism, like all nationalisms of its era, found complicated. Its Greek and Armenian and Jewish and Levantine communities, its foreign embassies and concessions, its culture of multiple languages and layered identities. All of this represented an Ottoman pluralism that the nationalist project was not designed to accommodate. Ankara was none of these things. It was Anatolian, Turkish in its population and character, free of imperial associations, free of foreign presence, positioned at the geographic center of the territory the nationalist movement had defended. Making Ankara the capital was not simply a practical decision about administrative location. It was a statement about what the new Turkey was and what it was refusing to be. The context for the Republic's founding was catastrophe barely survived. The armistice ending the First World War for the Ottoman Empire was signed on the 30th of October, 1918. Allied forces occupied strategic points throughout what remained of the empire within weeks. Istanbul was occupied by Allied forces beginning in November 1918. The city, that had not been under foreign military control since 1453, was suddenly full of British officers and French soldiers and foreign flags flying over buildings the Ottoman government still nominally controlled. The Treaty of Sèvres, signed in August 1920, proposed to partition what remained of Ottoman territory among the Allied powers and their clients, leaving a rump Turkish state in central Anatolia with no access to the sea. Mustafa Kemal did not accept it. Kemal was 40 years old in 1919. He had made his military reputation at Gallipoli in 1915, commanding the Ottoman defense against the Allied amphibious assault with a tactical intelligence and personal courage that prevented a breakthrough that might have ended the war years earlier. In May 1919, he landed at the Black Sea port of Samsun and began organizing armed resistance. The Turkish War of Independence that followed lasted from 1919 to 1923. The Greek campaign was the most consequential. Greece, encouraged by the British government and believing that the long-dreamed expansion into Anatolia had finally become possible, had landed troops at Smyrna in May 1919 and pushed deep into the Anatolian interior. Kemal's counter-offensive launched in August 1922, drove the Greek army back to the Aegean coast in 3 weeks. The city of Smyrna burned in September 1922 in events whose precise origin and the question of responsibility for the destruction of the city's Greek and Armenian quarters remain genuinely contested among historians. The population exchange formalized in the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923 was one of the largest forced migrations in modern history. Approximately 1.5 million Greeks living in Turkey were transferred to Greece. Approximately 500,000 Muslims living in Greece were transferred to Turkey. People whose families had inhabited specific places for generations were uprooted on the basis of their religion. Because religion, rather than language or self-identification, was the criterion the treaty used to define who was Greek and who was Turkish. The republic that Kemal proclaimed on the 29th of October, 1923, exactly 470 years after the fall of Constantinople, was a different kind of political entity from anything Istanbul had previously served. It was a nation-state, not an empire. Its capital was Ankara, and Kemal moved quickly to transform every aspect of the society it governed. The Sultanate was abolished in November 1922. The Caliphate was abolished in March 1924. Religious courts were abolished. The dervish orders were banned. The fez was prohibited. The Arabic script used to write Ottoman Turkish was replaced by a Latin alphabet. The Islamic calendar was replaced by the Gregorian. Surnames were made mandatory. Kemal himself took the surname Ataturk, father of the Turks. In 1934, each reform targeted a specific aspect of what Kemal regarded as the backward-looking culture that had prevented the Ottoman Empire from modernizing effectively. Taken together, they amounted to a revolution in daily life imposed by a state that had just demonstrated its willingness to fight for its existence. In 1934, Kemal signed a decree converting the Hagia Sophia from a mosque to a museum. The mosaics were uncovered and conserved. The building was open to visitors of all faiths. The Islamic worship conducted in it for nearly 5 centuries ended. For a Turkish secular nationalist, it was an act of civilizational confidence. A statement that Turkey could claim a building of world importance as world heritage rather than as a symbol of a single religion. For a devout Muslim, it was something quite different. The Hagia Sophia had been consecrated as a mosque by Mehmed II in 1453. Its conversion to a museum was experienced by many as a reversal of a sacred act, a repudiation of Ottoman Islamic heritage in favor of Western secular norms. That tension was genuine in 1934. It remained genuine for 86 years. Kemal himself died in Istanbul on the 10th of November, 1938, in a bedroom of the Dolmabahce Palace on the Bosphorus shore. He was 57 years old. The clocks in the palace were stopped at 9:05 in the morning, the moment of his death, and many remain stopped at that time today. His body was taken to Ankara, where it rests in a monumental mausoleum called Anıt Kabir, the memorial tomb, looking out over the capital he chose over Istanbul. Every year, on the 10th of November, at 9:05 in the morning, Turkey stops for a minute of silence. Car horns sound, factory whistles blow, people on the street pause where they stand. Istanbul did not collapse after losing its status as capital. Cities with 2,600 years of history do not collapse because a government moves its offices to another city. But it diminished. The population, which had reached perhaps 1 million by the early 20th century, fell during the years of war and population exchange and recovered only slowly. The grand buildings that had housed the ambassadors of the great powers became consulates. The particular energy of a place where decisions are made migrated to Ankara. For a period in the 1920s and 30s, Istanbul experienced something its entire previous history had not prepared it for. Not invasion, not Siege, not plague, not fire, though all of these had come before. It experienced the specific melancholy of a city that had been important in a particular way and was no longer important in that way. A city watching the center of gravity shift elsewhere. But in the Fanar district, the patriarch of the ecumenical church still conducted his services. In the Grand Bazaar, merchants still negotiated in multiple languages. In the neighborhoods along the Bosphorus, the fishermen still set their lines in the water that had been there, and would be there, regardless of which flag flew over the city on any given morning. What came next would transform Istanbul once more, in ways that even Mustafa Kemal could not have imagined. 15 million people were coming, and with them, a set of questions about identity and religion and belonging that the city is still in the middle of answering. Chapter 12. Istanbul, not Constantinople, the modern city. On the 6th of September, 1955, at approximately 9 o'clock in the evening, a crowd gathered in Taksim Square in the heart of Istanbul. Within hours, that crowd had become a mob moving through Greek neighborhoods, with a coordination that strongly suggests organization rather than spontaneous rage. Shops owned by Greeks were smashed and looted. Homes were broken into. Churches were vandalized. Cemeteries were desecrated. By the time the violence ended in the early hours of September 7th, an estimated 4,000 Greek-owned businesses had been destroyed or damaged. Over 1,000 Greek homes attacked, and dozens of Orthodox churches vandalized. The Jewish and Armenian communities suffered significant damage as well. The number of people killed is reported differently across sources, reflecting both the chaos of events and the limited official investigation that followed. The pogrom of September 6 and 7 was not spontaneous. Evidence accumulated by historians and journalists over subsequent decades strongly suggests that it was organized, at least in part, by networks with connections to nationalist organizations, and that the Turkish state had advanced knowledge of what was planned. A fabricated news report claiming that the house in Thessaloniki, where Ataturk had been born, had been bombed by Greeks, was used as a pretext to trigger the violence. The report was false. The Turkish government declared martial law after the violence had done its work. The immediate consequence for Istanbul's Greek community was devastating and irreversible. The Greek population of Istanbul, which had survived the 1923 population exchange through a treaty exemption, which had numbered approximately 100,000 in the 1940s, and which had already been declining through emigration driven by discriminatory taxes and economic pressures, was shattered by September 1955. In the weeks and months that followed, Greeks left Istanbul in large numbers. For Athens and Thessaloniki and Australia and the United States, for anywhere that was not the city their families had inhabited for generations. The Greek community that had existed in Istanbul in an unbroken line from the Byzantine period, that had survived the Ottoman conquest and 5 centuries of Ottoman rule, that had produced scholars and merchants and architects and the patriarchs who had led the Orthodox Church through every crisis the city had faced, effectively ceased to exist as a significant presence in Istanbul in the years after 1955. Today, the Greek community of Istanbul numbers perhaps 2,000 to 3,000 people. Most are elderly. The ecumenical patriarchate remains, the last institutional remnant of a community that once numbered in the hundreds of thousands, its patriarch still resident in the Fanar district, its influence in the global Orthodox world vastly exceeding its physical presence in the city. The Halki Seminary, the theological school that trained Orthodox clergy for generations on an island in the Sea of Marmara, has been closed by the Turkish government since 1971 and remains closed despite decades of international appeals. The Armenian community, already catastrophically diminished by the events of 1915, was further reduced by 1955, and by subsequent pressures, it numbers today perhaps 60 to 70,000 people, maintaining churches and schools and cultural institutions with a tenacity that reflects both the depth of their roots in the city and the difficulty of the conditions under which those roots have been maintained. The Jewish community, whose Sephardic core had been in Istanbul since the expulsion from Spain in 1492, had been declining through emigration since the establishment of Israel in 1948. It numbers today perhaps 15,000 people, compared to perhaps 80,000 in the 1930s. What these numbers describe, taken together, is the progressive homogenization of a city that had been defined by its plurality. The Istanbul of 2026 is overwhelmingly Turkish and Muslim in its population in a way that the Istanbul of 1900 was not. The transformation was the product of specific policies, specific acts of violence, specific economic pressures, and the specific logic of ethnic nationalism that shaped the 20th century across much of the world. Something was lost in that transformation, something irreplaceable. The Istanbul that was many things at once required many peoples to produce it. When those peoples left, what they had built remained as architecture and as memory. But the living culture that had generated both was gone. Take a moment with that before we move forward. The streets of Balat, the old Jewish neighborhood near the Golden Horn, are still there. The wooden houses with their overhanging upper stories still lean toward each other across the narrow lanes. The synagogues are still there, some of them maintained now by communities too small to fill them on any ordinary day. The churches of the Greek and Armenian neighborhoods are still there, their interiors tended by congregations that fit in a corner of the space their grandparents filled. These are not ruins. They are living spaces maintained by living people. But they carry the particular quiet of places whose population has moved on while the buildings stayed. That quiet is part of Istanbul now. It has been for 70 years. The second half of the 20th century brought a different kind of transformation. Not the loss of plurality, which was largely accomplished by the 1960s, but an explosion of scale that no previous chapter of the city's history had prepared it for. The population of Istanbul in 1950 was approximately 1 million people. The population of Istanbul today is approximately 15 to 16 million, making it the largest city in Europe by most measures and one of the 20 largest cities in the world. That growth from 1 million to 15 million in roughly 70 years is one of the most dramatic episodes of urban expansion in modern history. It was driven by internal migration from rural Anatolia. As Turkey's rural population moved to the cities in search of economic opportunity, following the same pattern that industrialization produced across the developing world in the 20th century. Istanbul, as the country's largest and most economically dynamic city, absorbed an enormous share of that migration. The physical consequence was the Gecekondu settlements, whose name translates roughly as built overnight, that appeared on the hills around the historic core with a speed that municipal authorities could not manage. The hills on which the Gecekondus appeared were the same hills that had been defined for 2,500 years by the great monuments of successive civilizations. The Theodosian walls found themselves with settlements pressed against their outer face. Archaeological sites beneath virtually every street in the historic peninsula were built over or left unexcavated because the pressure of housing a rapidly growing population was more immediately urgent than what lay beneath the ground. The tension between the city's historical inheritance and the demands of a modern metropolis of 15 million people is the central urban planning challenge of contemporary Istanbul, and one for which no satisfactory resolution has yet been found. UNESCO designated the historic areas of Istanbul as a World Heritage Site in 1985. The designation has had some protective effect, but has not resolved the fundamental conflict between preservation and development. The infrastructure of the modern city has been transformed by projects of genuine ambition. The Marmaray Tunnel, completed in 2013, runs beneath the Bosphorus and connects the European and Asian sides of the city by rail for the first time in its history. The project required extraordinary archaeological care because virtually every meter of excavation produced Byzantine or earlier remains. The Bosphorus Bridge, completed in 1973 and now officially named the July 15th Martyrs Bridge after the events of 2016, was the first fixed link between the European and Asian shores. For the first time in the city's history, a person could walk between Europe and Asia without a boat. The bridge has since been joined by 2 additional crossings. The third, completed in 2016 and officially named after Sultan Selim I, spans the northern Bosphorus near the point where Darius I built his bridge of boats 2,500 years ago. That continuity, the same strategic point connecting the same 2 worlds across 2.5 millennia, is the kind of detail that Istanbul produces with a regularity that would seem contrived if it appeared in a novel. The political life of modern Istanbul has been turbulent in ways that reflect the turbulence of Turkish politics more broadly. Turkey has experienced military coups or coup attempts in 1960, 1971, 1980, and most dramatically in July 2016, when a faction of the military attempted to seize power and was defeated by a combination of loyal military units, civilian resistance, and a population that took to the streets in numbers that made the coup's success impossible. The events of the 15th and 16th of July, 2016, when tanks appeared on the Bosphorus bridges and aircraft bombed the Grand National Assembly building in Ankara, left 251 people dead and over 2,000 wounded. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, whose Justice and Development Party had governed Turkey since 2002, survived the attempt and oversaw a subsequent purge of suspected coup participants that extended across the military, the judiciary, the civil service, and the academic world on a scale that international observers documented with considerable concern. Istanbul was at the center of events in ways that reflected its position as the country's economic and cultural capital even after a century of Ankara's political primacy. The Bosphorus bridges were the symbolic and tactical targets. The crowds that gathered on the bridges and in the streets were Istanbul crowds. The night of the 15th of July was, in its compressed drama, its use of the Bosphorus as stage, its mixture of military hardware and civilian defiance, unmistakably an Istanbul story. No other city has bridges between continents to put tanks on. Then came the Hagia Sophia. On the 10th of July, 2020, Turkey's Council of State annulled the 1934 decree that had converted the building to a museum. On the same day, President Erdogan signed a decree transferring it to the Directorate of Religious Affairs and ordering it opened for Muslim worship. On the 24th of July, the first Friday prayers in 86 years were held in the building that Justinian had built, that Mehmed had converted, that Ataturk had secularized, and that Erdogan had reconverted. The decision was immediate international news. The Greek government described it as an open provocation. UNESCO expressed concern. The United States Department of State expressed disappointment. The Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew I, whose patriarchate sits a few kilometers from the Hagia Sophia in the Fana district, described the decision as a source of grief for Christians throughout the world. The Turkish government's position was that the Hagia Sophia was sovereign Turkish territory and that decisions about its use were Turkey's alone to make. The building would remain open to tourists of all faiths. The mosaics would be covered during prayer times rather than destroyed. The change was presented not as a repudiation of Ataturk's secularism, but as a restoration of the building's proper religious function. The decision cannot be understood outside the political context of Erdogan's Turkey and the cultural politics of a government that has consistently drawn on Ottoman and Islamic imagery as sources of national identity and legitimacy. It was a powerful symbolic act addressed as much to a domestic audience as to the international community. A statement that Turkey was unapologetically Muslim and unapologetically sovereign. It was also, in the specific context of Istanbul's history, something the city had seen before. The Hagia Sophia has never been simply a building. It has been, across 1,500 years, a mirror in which whatever civilization held it saw its own image reflected. When the Byzantines held it, they saw Christian civilization at its height. When the Ottomans held it, they saw Islamic empire triumphant. When Ataturk's republic held it, they saw secular modernity overcoming religious tradition. When Erdogan's Turkey reconverted it, they saw Islamic identity reasserted against Western secular norms. The building absorbs all of these meanings without being defined by any of them. It stood for 1,000 years as a cathedral. It stood for nearly 500 years as a mosque. It stood for 86 years as a museum. Whatever it becomes next, it will still be there. The dome will still float above the Golden Horn. The light will still come through the windows in ways that stop people in the middle of whatever they were thinking. The marble will still hold the marks of 15 centuries of human hands. The Hagia Sophia is the most complete expression of what Istanbul is, a place that cannot be pinned down, that answers to different names and purposes and civilizations without losing the fundamental quality that makes it unlike anything else in the world. It is always in the middle of becoming something. It never quite finishes. The city around it is the same. Istanbul today is a city of 15 million people simultaneously trying to be a modern European metropolis, a regional power center for the Middle East and Central Asia, a global tourism destination, a commercial hub, and the custodian of a historical inheritance that few cities on earth can match for depth and complexity. It is a city where you can see a Byzantine mosaic and an Ottoman tile in the same neighborhood, where you can take a Bosphorus ferry that passes under a bridge named for a 16th century sultan on its way to a waterfront cafe playing contemporary Turkish pop, where the call to prayer from a mosque designed by Sinan competes acoustically with the traffic noise of a highway built in the 1990s. The tensions that define contemporary Istanbul are real. The tension between religious and secular identity, the tension between European orientation and Ottoman Islamic identity, the tension between the demands of a global city and the preservation of a historical fabric that cannot be indefinitely stressed, the tension between the Turkish majority culture and the diminished but still present minority communities that are the last remnants of what the city was when it was an empire. These tensions are not new. Istanbul has been generating and resolving tensions since Bizas looked at the Golden Horn and decided to build here. The city has never been at peace with itself for long, because a city at the intersection of empires and continents and faiths does not get to be simple. What it gets to be is alive. Alive in the way that only places with very long memories and very complicated presents can be. Alive with the weight of everything that happened here and the uncertainty of everything that is still happening. Go back to the Galata Bridge. It is early morning. Before the tourist crowds arrive, the fishermen are already at the railings with their lines in the water. The first ferries are crossing the Golden Horn. On the hill to the south, the dome of Justinian's church catches the light before the streets beneath it do. Try to hold the full span of what happened on this ground. 660 years before the Common Era. Greek sailors from Megara looked at the water moving below this point and saw a harbour so perfect it seemed intentional. They built a city. 2,600 years later. People are still fishing from a bridge above the same water. The fish are still there. The fishermen are still there. The harbour is still there. In that span of time, the city above the Golden Horn has been called Byzantium, Constantinople, and Istanbul. It has been governed by Megarian colonists, Persian satraps, Macedonian successors, Roman governors, Byzantine emperors, Latin Crusader kings, and Ottoman sultans. It has been pagan and Christian and Muslim and briefly, officially, secular and Muslim again. It has been the most important city in the world, and a former capital watching its influence migrate elsewhere, and a city of 15 million people reasserting itself on the global stage. It has been sacked, besieged, and rebuilt more times than any single chapter of its history could contain. It has survived plague in the 6th century and plague in the 14th century and a pandemic in the 21st. It has survived earthquakes and fires and military coups and economic collapse. It has survived the end of two world empires that used it as their capital. It is still here. What Istanbul has always been, across every name and every ruler and every religion and every era, is the place where the conversation between East and West happens. Not always peacefully, not always fairly, not always to the benefit of everyone involved. But the conversation has never stopped. The Bosphorus has never stopped flowing. The ships have never stopped coming. The people have never stopped arriving from somewhere else and making the city something it was not quite before they arrived. That capacity is what the city is. The capacity to take in Greek sailors and Roman engineers and Byzantine scholars and Ottoman conquerors and Jewish refugees and Genoese merchants and Anatolian migrants and 15 million people from every corner of a country that is itself a meeting point of worlds. To make from all of them something that is recognizably, stubbornly, unmistakably itself. No other city does this in quite the same way. No other city has been doing it for quite this long. The Hagia Sophia may remain as it is, or future generations may argue over it again. The tensions between secular and religious identity will resolve in one direction for a time, and then perhaps another. The bridges over the Bosphorus will carry more traffic. More people, more of the ordinary commercial and human energy that is the real substance of any city's life. And every morning, the fishermen will be on the Galata Bridge with their lines in the water. The light will come across the Marmara and catch the dome and the minarets and the towers of the old walls and the glass facades of the new towers rising along the Bosphorus shore. The ferries will cross. The call to prayer will sound across the water. The city will wake up and begin again. That is what Istanbul has been doing for 2,600 years. There is no sign it intends to stop.